I've always felt that there should have been an album before Bleach, because by the time that we recorded the songs off of Bleach, we were really into that kind of music. I mean, we don't regret it now, but at the time we should have put out the Fecal Matter tape, or at least a lot of the songs that were on Fecal Matter tape. We should have re-recorded them.
That was from the interview Kurt did with MTV in December of '93. Before Nirvana, Kurt had a band of sorts called Fecal Matter. It wasn't really much of a band, it was basically just him. But in 1985, Kurt and drummer Dale Crover recorded a Fecal Matter demo.
Dale Crover, the drummer for the Melvins, and I made a demo in like 85, late 85, at my aunt's house on a 4-track. I played a little bit of bass on it, and Dale played bass. That was my band, my imaginary band.
There are 17 tracks on the Fecal Matter demo tape, even though there are only 7 on the original version that Kurt handed out to his friends. I'll explain why shortly. Also, of the 17 tracks, one of those songs does appear on Bleach. So there is a Fecal Matter song on Nirvana's debut record. Again, I'll tell you the story there in a few minutes. As mentioned, Bleach was Nirvana's debut album, followed by Nevermind, and then the next record was Incesticide. Incesticide, however, does not count as an official studio album, because unlike Bleach, Nevermind, and Utero, Incesticide is a compilation album. Some of the songs which appear on Incesticide were previously unreleased tracks the band had recorded during the Bleach era. In this clip, Kurt says these noisier Incesticide songs, plus the Fecal Matter songs, that should have been what Nirvana released as their debut album instead of Bleach.
Most of the stuff on Incesticide should have come out before Bleach, actually, because that was just a period of our band. That was just part of our progression, you know. We were really into experimental, noisy kind of music, you know. I mean, that's always been the case with us. We always should have put out something a little bit before Bleach.
So had you wanted to put some of the older songs on Bleach and ended up just doing the new stuff on your own, or was that sort of...
I think at the time...
Did you write new songs for Bleach?
Yeah, we did write new songs for Bleach. There were a lot of songs that were just written within the 2 weeks or even the last week prior to recording. At that time, we only had maybe 6 songs. I guess is what I'm trying to say is that we wrote so many songs in that week right before we recorded that we were excited about the new songs, so we wanted to record them. But initially, we wanted to just record the few new songs that we had and re-record most of the stuff that was on the Fecal Matter tape. And that would have been the album. You know, it would have been a lot more like Incesticide, but we just happened to write so many new songs that we just put it on Bleach. And they just happened to have been more in the 70s vein, you know.
Now, as mentioned, there are 17 tracks on the Fecal Matter demo tape, but only 7 songs appear on the original cassette version Kurt gave to his friends. Kurt never publicly explained why he did this, but it's believed Kurt cut down the demo tape to just 7 songs because he only wanted to showcase the best material. Now, here's where things can get confusing. During the Fecal Matter recording session at Aunt Mary's house, Kurt and Dale recorded a total of 13 songs, not 17. So in that case, why are there 17 songs on the full version of the demo tape instead of 13? This is the track list for the 17-track version. Track 2 is a sound montage Kurt made by himself. Tracks 7 and 15 are the exact same song. The only difference is track 15 is an instrumental version. Track 16 is literally a song from another band. For whatever reason, Kurt decided to include the song Turn Around by Devo on this demo tape. It had nothing to do with Fecal Matter. And lastly, the closing track on the demo tape, track 17, is just a compilation of guitar riffs from different tracks on the demo tape. Now, how did the full 17-track version even appear online? Kurt only distributed 7 songs publicly, so where did the rest of it come from? On August 6 of 2015, the full 17-track version was leaked online by an anonymous source. As of this posting in 2026, it's still not known who leaked the full demo. There's no real evidence to suggest the leak came from Kurt's family, or Nirvana's management, or even Nirvana's former members. According to LiveNirvana.com, the leak was done by 2 anonymous people who somehow got a hold of the full demo. It's interesting how, despite the fact Nirvana is one of the biggest bands in history, no one knows who leaked the Fecal Matter demo. In any case, as Kurt mentioned, in hindsight he felt the original Nirvana album should have been a combination of Fecal Matter songs and Incesticide songs.
Have you heard the Incesticide record? Mm-hmm. That's the kind of band we used to be. We used to be more like Gang of Four, new wave influence, like more experimental with more noise and different effects boxes and stuff. And then we started getting too much into straight ahead garage grunge music, and that's pretty much what Bleach was like. And then Nevermind was more pop, a little bit more commercial. And now we're kind of reverting back to the first thing, which would sound more like Incesticide, just weirder stuff.
That was from the interview Kurt did with Brazilian journalist Zeca Camargo on January 21st, 1993. Now, going back to the December 93 interview, here Kurt talks more about the Fecal Matter demo tape.
I had the tape for about a year or so, and I was always trying to push it on my friends, to try to get them into starting a band with me. And one day Krist, after probably hearing it a few times, just decided, hey, this is pretty good, I knew him for at least 3 years before we started playing seriously in a band together. I don't think he ever really had very many aspirations to be in a band, really. He just liked playing guitar. I knew he had a guitar for years. We had, side bands with Buzz and the Melvins, other members of the Melvins and friends of ours.
Kurt spent a lot of time with the Melvins in Aberdeen as a teenager. He was very close friends with them, especially with Buzz Osborne and Dale Crover. As discussed, Dale is the drummer Kurt recorded the Fecal Matter demo tape with. I'm going to share with you now a clip from my interview with Dale Crover where he talks about whether Fecal Matter was an actual band or just some sort of side project. Were you guys an actual band, just you and Kurt?
Sort of, I guess. I mean, there might have been a couple of performances, like maybe at a party or something like that. I remember a friend of mine was kind of in charge of a bar that kind of had music for one or two kind of gigs. No real official shows. Kurt was always trying to put together something. There was a version as well that had Buzz playing bass and Mike Dillard, the first Melvins drummer, playing. I can't remember if that was before. It might have been after that demo. I know they started to play. I don't know if there's anything that exists recording-wise. It never went beyond, some jamming in a rehearsal room until Novoselic started playing with them. Now Krist had moved away for a while to Arizona and then came back. There's actually a letter that Buzz had sent to Krist when he was living in Arizona talking about Kurt and that demo and saying how he's got some pretty good songs.
Krist Novoselic moved to Phoenix, Arizona around March of 1986 with his then-girlfriend and future wife, Shelley Dilley. Phoenix is several hours flying south of Aberdeen, Kurt Cobain's hometown, so Krist was way out of town. Buzz Osborne's letter about Kurt's Fecal Matter demo is one of the reasons that when Krist returned to Aberdeen, he had some interest in playing musically with Kurt professionally. Here's some more backstory. Krist moved to Phoenix because he had some friends there and he was hoping to find better job opportunities than he could in Aberdeen. In an interview with journalist John Hughes, Krist said the following in 2008, quote, "I moved to Arizona because I had some friends there, and 1986 wasn't a very good year for Aberdeen. On the other hand, it seemed like there was all this opportunity in Phoenix, but unfortunately the wages were very low. You couldn't get ahead." End quote. Krist and Shelley stayed in Phoenix for about 6 months before they returned to Aberdeen. Once Krist returned, he reconnected with Kurt, again thanks in part to Buzz Osborne's letter. A few months later, in early 1987, Kurt and Krist officially formed Nirvana. Though the band wasn't called Nirvana yet, they went through a series of names such as Ted Ed Fred, Pencap Chew, Skid Row, and others, before settling on Nirvana in early 1988. The band's first ever show under the name Nirvana took place on March 19th, 1988. Now, back to Dale.
So, when Krist came back from Arizona, that's when those two hooked up and kind of started playing together and looking for a drummer. They found Aaron Burkhart, who was another local guy, and they were playing with him for a while. And then that's before I did that original demo with them.
That demo Dale just referred to is not the Fecal Matter demo. Dale appears on both the Fecal Matter demo from 1985 as well as Nirvana's first ever demo from 1988. That's what Dale was referring to there. On January 23rd, 1988, Kurt, Krist, and Dale recorded 10 songs with producer Jack Endino. This is Nirvana's first ever official recording session. I've interviewed both Jack Endino and Dale Crover about this recording session. I'll be showing those clips in a moment. These are the 10 songs Nirvana recorded that day. Of these 10 songs, 2 of them are actually Fecal Matter songs, Downer and Spank Through. This 1988 version of Downer actually ended up on Bleach. Spank Through, however, did not. There are 5 known different studio recordings of that song. 5. But not one version appears on any of Nirvana's studio albums. Bleach, Nevermind, or in Utero. It doesn't even appear on Nirvana's compilation album Incesticide. They all came out on various other Nirvana-related releases. For instance, one version of Spank Through appears on Sub Pop 200. Sub Pop is Nirvana's original record label. In December of 1988, they released Sub Pop 200, which was a compilation record of different artists on the label. But the most famous version of Spank Through is not a studio recording. It's a live version of the song, which Nirvana performed in 1992 at the Reading Festival. Now, the following are clips of Jack Endino and Dale Crover discussing that famous first recording session on January 23rd of 88. The first song you guys recorded, if I remember correctly, was If You Must.
Yes.
From what I've read, apparently Kurt eventually ended up not liking that particular song. Do you know why he felt that way?
Yes, I think I do, because I think he was a little self-conscious about not being perceived as too metal or too heavy, because I think really in his heart he wanted to do something a little more pop, melodic. And If You Must is a pretty heavy song. And, possibly, the influence of having the Melvins drummer in your band would make you want to write some big fat riffs.
Yeah.
Which may have contributed to his songwriting in some way.
Your relationship started essentially with a phone call from Kurt. Is this correct?
Correct. Yes. Just like any other band, he just called the studio, asked for me, and said, hey, we want to record some songs. We only have enough money for a day. When can you get us in? And he mentioned that he was playing with Dale Crover, who was going to help out on the session. I figured, all right, if this guy's good enough to be playing with the Melvins drummer, he's got to be the real deal, because I was already a big fan of the Melvins. So, yeah, we booked the session January 23rd, 1988. And they came in with Dale drumming, and they didn't have a name for the band. He just told me to put it down as Kurt Cobain. And they did 10 songs in 3 or 4 hours, all live. He did all the vocals afterwards in one take. And probably between 3 p.m. and 5:30 p.m. we mixed all of it down, mixed, if you want to call it mixing. It was just an 8-track recording. I banged out a quick rough mix for them, and they went off and played a show in Tacoma that night with Dale, which at the Community World Theater in Tacoma, which I believe, I've looked into this, and it was the only show, well, Dale said it was the only show that he actually played with them during that time period. Because later, he did a tour with them, actually, but it was like a couple years later.
So just a general question about the Dale demo session. They came around noontime at Reciprocal Recordings, and they were only there for, X amount of hours, because then they had to go to the Community World Theater in Tacoma that night for a show.
Correct.
I think you mentioned a little bit earlier when we were talking now that Kurt recorded all his vocals afterwards, as in, did they do an instrumental first?
Correct. They did all the songs instrumentally, top to bottom, 10 songs in a row. And then, yeah, it's pretty impossible with a bunch of people standing in a room with guitars and drums to get keeper vocals. For one thing, you're concentrating on your vocal or you're concentrating on your guitar, and it's very hard, unless you're very, very good at this, it's hard to get the best possible take on the guitar and the best take on the vocal at the same time, unless you're a really seasoned player, which he was not. Even for the next year, most of his shows, his singing suffered somewhat because he wasn't used to playing and singing at the same time. He just hadn't played enough shows. At that point, I don't know if he'd played any shows, maybe 2 or 3. And the other thing is that if you're standing in a room playing guitar next to a drummer, the vocal mic is going to pick up way too much drums. So it's pretty standard to have maybe a guide vocal where you have a mic out there and you sort of sing a few verses, or you just call out the cues to the band like, hey, here's the verse, here's the chorus, okay, we're going to the solo now. And then you go back later and you do the real vocals in a nice silent room with like loud headphones and a good microphone and so forth under, better conditions really, where you can actually get a usable vocal recording. So like most of the bands I did at that period, and still to this day, I do a lot of bands where the band sets up and we isolate the instruments as much as we can, but they bang it out live. And then we do the vocals afterwards. And the other thing is vocals can take minutes or days. It really depends on the singer.
Yeah.
How many punch-ins are you going to need to do? And Kurt was one of those, 1 or 2 takes and it's done. And I think we did most of those vocals in 1 take. He just went from song to song. Like there was 1 or 2 where he had to stop and think about the words for a minute. So, okay, wait a minute, let me make sure because again, all they'd done is rehearse at that point. I don't think they played live very many shows at all. The fact that he had the words memorized is impressive in itself. He probably didn't have all of them memorized. I don't really remember because I couldn't see what he was doing out in the room there, whether he had a lot of paper with him or what. And nor, I don't really remember that exactly. But I do remember he did it very quickly. And if we did more than 1 take on anything, I don't remember it. It's possible we did. But in any case, after about, maybe an hour of setup and 2 or 3 hours of recording, the 10 songs were recorded, and I had to just mix it quickly so they could walk out the door with a cassette. Yeah, so that was the session that yielded anything Nirvana that has Dale Crover on it that's not live is from that session as far as I know. If You Must never got released officially until the box set. Yeah, I don't know. Any artist is like that. I mean, they write things and then they change their mind, They go, well, that's not really the direction I want to be known for. Let's do this other thing instead. So that's all it was. It was an early song, I think.
Yeah.
There were certain songs like that one, like Big Long Now, which was a song we recorded during the Bleach session. I remember that one. Kurt said, oh, there's already enough slow, heavy songs on Bleach. Let's leave that one off. So I saved it, and that got used on Incesticide. There were 2 songs that ended up being remixed and put on the Bleach record later.
Do you remember which songs those were?
I don't. You can find that information easily enough. One is Paper Cuts. One is Floyd the Barber. So see, I do remember. Paper Cuts, I think Paper Cuts, Floyd the Barber, and I think there was one more song that was used as a bonus track on some versions of Bleach that is also from the Dale session. It's a little short one. Huh?
Was it Downer?
It might be Downer, it might be Beeswax. I can never remember which one it is. But it got stuck on the end of some of the versions of Bleach. Mm-hmm. And then the other songs ended up on Incesticide, possibly including Downer. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think Downer is on both the Bleach Extended and Incesticide.
Yes, and the final song, the 10th song, was a sort of truncated version of a song called Pen Cap Chew, which only exists as a verse, a chorus, and a second verse on the recording because the tape ran out. Mm-hmm. And we ended up fading it after the first chorus, I think. And that got used on the box set much later. So that was my first session with Nirvana.
And I wanted to ask you specifically actually about Pen Cap Chew. I'm glad you brought that up. So basically, as you were saying, the tape for that song ran out, so you guys didn't have a full recording of it, so you kind of had to put the fade at the end in order to make the song, I guess, salvageable.
It's like half a song now. It's like one verse and one chorus and a fade.
Yeah. So was there any other Nirvana song that essentially, for lack of a better term, like were you able to kind of polish up anything else Nirvana related?
There was, I think there was something on the live Bleach thing where I took a bass DI and reamped it through my SVT rig because something like I had the direct signal, but I didn't have the mic signal at one point in the song, and Krist was using a distorted bass, and so I said, well, I got the direct signal. I can recreate the distorted bass sound here where the mic crapped out. But something like that. But that's like, I didn't have to re-record anything or fly anything around. No, I mean, and remember, back when I was doing this stuff, we didn't have Pro Tools or any of that digital stuff. What you had was what you had. I didn't start getting heavily into doing things in the digital multi-track world until around the turn of the century, shall we say.
So as I mentioned, I went to Aberdeen about a year ago. I went to Seattle the same trip, and I spoke with Jack and Dino on that trip. And he discussed with me that the reason he initially agreed to record Nirvana was because of their connection with you. Right? He saw that, the Melvin's drummer Dale was in there.
Yeah, well, I mean, Kurt basically cold called him, But the studio had, they had an ad in the local music magazine, The Rocket. They had an ad in there with a phone number, and anybody could go record there. But I think, because Kurt called and said, the drummer from the Melvins is playing with us, then they're like, oh, okay, and they got time right away. So, and, at that studio, I think maybe because that Soundgarden had recorded there is why we knew about it and Kurt knew about it. So, I think he probably figured like, if they know about Soundgarden and recorded them, then that'll be perfect for us or whatever, So yeah, good thing he said yes, and then Jack liked it right away. I mean, he was really impressed and I think immediately told Sub Pop people about it because they had called like literally the next day and were like, or somebody had called just to say like, oh, hey, like we're interested in this already. So funny,
cool, That's really cool. So what was the recording like? From what I understand, you guys had like 5 hours or something really tight to get all those songs done.
Yeah, because we had a gig that night in Tacoma and we had to get to it. So we tried to cram it all in. And I mean, I listened to some of those songs and it's like, I can tell that I'm speeding up really badly, but it was just a demo, I mean, it was a demo so they could like get gigs and also to find a drummer. They knew that I wasn't going to stick around, so, a demo to get a drummer and they got a record deal instead.
That's really cool.
But I mean, and also I can remember too, like part of the reason I'm speeding up so badly is because, Seattle, even back then, was known for its super strong coffee. And we were like drinking like an immense amount of coffee and also eating chocolate covered espresso beans and just trying to get all the songs done in one take. And I was jacked.
Throughout 1988, Nirvana would record about 20 more songs with Jack and Dino, including a song called Big Long Now. It was recorded during the Bleach sessions in December of '88, though the song ultimately was not included on Bleach. It was left off the record and didn't see the light of day until 4 years later when it was released in December of 1992 on Incesticide. Big Long Now's inclusion on Incesticide was due in large part to Jack and Dino. Jack once told the following to journalist Jillian G. Garr, quote, Big Long Now. I argued with them about it. I said, how come you're not using it on Bleach? And Kurt said that there were already enough slow, heavy songs on the record. He didn't want to weigh it down. And that is the slowest, other than Sifting. It is the slowest, heaviest song. Sifting is a better song. Big Long Now is big and long, and it's very slow. But I just think it had an amazing vocal take on it. I pretty much just nagged him about it for a long time. When Incesticide came up, I said, you guys have got to use this song. I've still got this outtake from Bleach. So it ended up on Incesticide. I kept reminding them about it. You guys, what about Big Long Now? It's a brilliant song. It's got a great vocal. End quote. When did you first hear that Incesticide was like coming together? I read that Krist gave you a call and asked if you had any other songs. Like, is this correct? Like, how did the process start with getting Incesticide together?
They needed a record after Nevermind. They needed something to be out that year. And they weren't ready to make a new record yet. They just weren't. As you can see by, in October of '92, they only had 6 songs ready. So they weren't ready to record until the following year. But the label was asking, they said, okay, we've got to capitalize on this. Nevermind blew up. It's huge. We need to put something out. So someone made the decision to gather all the singles and B-sides and unreleased material together as kind of a stopgap. And I may have made the call myself to remind them that I had an outtake from Bleach sitting on the shelf, which was Big Long Now. Or possibly Krist called me and asked me what I had. But I remember specifically bringing that up, and because they had forgotten about the song entirely. So that's the best of my recollection right now. I don't remember who made the phone call, but I do remember that I did have to remind them that it existed, and it got added to the very tail end of Incesticide. That's the last song on side 2.
How did your relationship start with Nirvana?
I'm pretty sure they heard some of the early Soundgarden recordings I had done, which ultimately became the Screaming Life record.
Nirvana heard that EP?
Yes, yeah. I think they would have heard that. They would have heard the Screaming Life EP, which I think came out in late 87. I could be wrong, but I think so. They called me in 1988, January 1988, and Kurt called, and he just wanted to come up and record a few songs, make a demo basically, and they didn't have a band name. And Dale Crover was playing drums with him at the time, just as a fill-in drummer. They didn't have a permanent drummer. And of course, Dale knew me. I'd known the Melvins for quite a while. Skinyard had played with them a few times. And Kurt, of course, being from Aberdeen, didn't know a lot of people in Seattle at the time, I don't think. But Dale probably, I'm thinking Dale maybe gave me a recommendation. I don't really know that. But Dale knew what I was doing and knew my band and knew the records I was making. And also, I'm pretty sure that Kurt heard some of the Soundgarden recordings I'd already done. At least so I've been told. Again, the internet, there's a lot of information out there. Make what you will of it. But in any case, he seemed to know that I was the guy he wanted to record with right then. So they came up and recorded 10 songs with me on January 23rd, 1988. And we recorded and mixed all 10 songs in 5 hours, basically one afternoon. And some of those songs in that actual form, and I mean, I spend about an hour per song. No, 15 minutes per song mixing those songs, because I think we mixed the 10 songs in, just over 2 hours. Those mixes are the ones that ended up on Incesticide.
Really?
Yeah, which always made me think, gee, maybe if if somebody gave me a chance to, spend an extra
10 minutes,
2 or 3 hours, maybe those mixes would be even better than they are. But they're not bad mixes; they're all right. I knew what I was doing at the time, so they don't sound bad. But I know I could have made them a little bigger, beefier, or whatever. But nobody complained.
Did you know that they went ahead with the label went ahead with making Incesticide? Were you notified of this?
Yeah, later on, of course. Yeah, of course I was. I was, and they just went ahead and used it, and I had nothing to say about it. They'd already made the decision.
Now, I want to switch gears back to Fecal Matter and take a bit more of a look at the history there. Just to recap, Kurt's Fecal Matter project was basically him and various members of the Melvins. Kurt and Dale recorded the Fecal Matter demo at Aunt Mary's house, Kurt's aunt from his mother's side. Aunt Mary lives about 45 minutes outside of Aberdeen. The person who drove them to Aunt Mary's house was Matt Lukin, the Melvins' original bass player. As Kurt himself mentioned earlier, this Fecal Matter recording session at Aunt Mary's house is thought to have taken place in late 1985. However, according to journalist Jillian G. Garr, she believes the session took place in March of 1986. I'm going to read to you a section from her book, Entertain Us, The Rise of Nirvana. Quote, in the spring of 1986, Kurt decided to more formally document Fecal Matter's work, and Matt drove him and Dale back to Aunt Mary's house to record another demo. This recording session was previously thought to have happened in December of '85, but Mary remembers it taking place around Easter. They set up in my music room and they just crank it up, she recalls. It was loud. They would put down the music first, and then he'd put the headphones on and all you could hear was Kurt's voice screaming through the house. It was pretty wild. My husband and I, we just look at each other and smile and go, "You think we should close the window so the neighbors don't hear? So they don't think we're beating him up or something?" Mary also noticed how Kurt had improved as a musician since his last visit. He was much more confident in his vocals, she observed, and he was more progressed in knowing what he wanted the thing to sound like. Kurt and Dale recorded a total of 13 of Kurt's songs, with Kurt on guitar and vocals, Dale on bass and drums. They survive as the earliest known examples of Kurt's songwriting. The music clearly reveals his influences: fast, thrashing punk, and the slower chug of hard rock. Vocally, he's still searching for a style. Having not yet found that familiar rasping drawl, he growls and shouts. He sings in a clipped British accent, he speaks in a mumbling drone. As Kurt later recalled, it was totally abrasive fast punk music. There were some Nirvana elements, some slower songs even then, and some heavy influence stuff. Lyrically, the songs took broad, sarcastic swipes at mainstream society. Aunt Mary recalls, "As far as really sharing his music with me and asking what I thought, he really didn't do that," she says. Kurt was very sensitive about the stuff that he wrote, and he was very careful about who he let hear it. He didn't really like someone just poking fun at it. And being a songwriter myself, I can understand that. One song in particular stands out, Spank Through. Of all the Fecal Matter songs, it veers the closest towards pop. The song is the only one from the Fecal Matter session to be officially released thus far, on the 2005 compilation Sliver, The Best of the Box. Spank Through and Downer would later be re-recorded, and Aneurysm would also be performed live for a brief period, while lyrics from other numbers would resurface in the Nirvana songs If You Must and even In His Youth. Kurt named the Fecal Matter tape Illiteracy Will Prevail, and immediately dubbed off copies for his friends with a handmade illustration on the J card of a pile of excrement. He spelled his name correctly on the inside of the J card, but on the outside credited himself as Kurt, Kurdt equals guitar mouth. It was the first time he was known to have spelled his name in this fashion, and he was credited as Kurt with a D on all future releases until the Smells Like Teen Spirit single, as well as in interviews and press releases. "I have no real reason," he later told Michael Azerrad about the various name spellings he used over the years. "I just didn't bother spelling it correctly. I didn't care." In any case, Dale Crover was later dismissive of the recording, telling writer Greg Prato in Grunge is Dead, "People talk about that demo like it's this unreleased thing that must be amazing, but not really. A crappy 4-track demo." At the time, Buzz Osborne thought otherwise, as he wrote in a letter to Krist and his girlfriend Shelley Dilley, who had moved to Arizona in early '86. The letter says the following, quote, "Cobain and Dale went up to his aunt's house and made a tape of some of Kurt's songs. I was pretty impressed. Some of his songs are real killer, despite the poor sound quality. It seems good, but could have been better with a little more time. Nevertheless, it's still a great demo. I think he could have some kind of future in music if he keeps at it." The letter was dated April 16th, 1986. More proof that the session happened in 86, not 85. Had the session had happened in 85, Kurt would have undoubtedly given Krist a tape then. And the letter makes it clear that Buzz is talking about a recent event, not something from 4 months ago when Krist was still living in Aberdeen. Kurt's aunt says the session happened around Easter, which in 86 was on March 30th, 2.5 weeks before Buzz wrote his letter. Kurt continued practicing the Fecal Matter songs with Buzz and Mike Dillard, but the project quickly fell apart. Instead, Kurt ended up making his public debut in a one-off trio called Brown Towel, a name misspelled Brown Cow on some posters, on May 3rd, 86, at Gesco, a venue affiliated with the Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington. Kurt recited his lyrics and poetry as Buzz and Dale backed him. End quote. The association with Nirvana, is it difficult to live with because it's everywhere all the time?
Yeah, I mean, it is strange. It's weird, that's for sure.
You knew Krist and Kurt. You know Dave for a while before they all got famous. And then when you see them get famous, like, what was that like for you?
Oh, yeah, I mean, the whole thing, it was totally surreal, you know? Because we were just on tour with them as well, before all of a sudden, like, MTV picked up their video, and then they were being played all the time. You know, there was definitely a buzz about them, and certainly about that record. And I think everybody thought it was going to do really well, but, you know, I mean, everybody was surprised at how that blew up.
So about a year prior to the release of Nevermind, you played drums with Nirvana during their 1990 Sonic Youth Tour, that tour being a big turning point in the band's history. At that point in time when things were really getting off the ground, were Kurt and Krist feeling any pressure mounting on them?
Those guys were keeping their heads about it. I mean, they're already having some success. And even when I was with them, we were here in LA and we were having meetings with A&R people and managers and stuff like that. Most of them at the time, they just kind of seemed like phony Hollywood types. But yeah, I mean, they knew that they were going to get signed somehow or something that was going to happen. Even Sonic Youth were doing really well. That tour that we did was for the Goo record, and they were kind of, I mean, for their band, like that was great. They were like selling punk rock gold. I remember thinking and talking to Krist, thinking like, you guys could probably do that and maybe even do a little bit better.
The following is from my interview with Bruce Pavitt, co-founder of Sub Pop, Nirvana's original record label. He talks about his reaction to the Dale Crover recordings, the first session that they did with Jack and Dino. The other co-founder of Sub Pop, Jonathan Pondman, is the one who presented the recordings to him. So going back to the very beginning of your relationship with Nirvana, from what I understand, when Jonathan Pondman first showed you the Dale demo, you weren't really that impressed by it. What was your initial reaction to that demo?
My initial reaction was that I thought it sounded good, that Kurt had a great voice, but the songwriting was a little immature. That was my take. And I still feel that in reviewing their first album, Bleach, I'd say the same thing. There are a couple of classic tracks on there. I think Blue and About a Girl in particular really stand the test of time. But to me, the real star of that album is actually the producer, Jack and Dino, because he created a record that just grabbed people with its essentially with its vibe and its presence. And he recorded for $600. So to me, Jack's the real genius behind that album. Kurt had a great voice, but the amazing thing about working with Nirvana is watching them grow and develop and get better and better and better. And that was an amazing thing to experience.
I interviewed Bruce Pavitt recently. Bruce was saying that because Jason Everman paid for the record, this record is arguably the most profitable record in history because Sub Pop paid $0 for it and they sold 2 million copies.
Yeah.
To compensate for the paying of the record, they put a giant poster of Jason Everman in some of the original Bleach vinyls. So,
that's awesome. And then he doesn't even play on the record.
Yeah.
So what happened with Jason? He's a bass player for Soundgarden. Yeah, but I mean, that's what happened.
They were having tryouts and he went ahead and did it. I don't know. Maybe he wasn't
really in the band anymore. It just didn't work.
We like the guy and stuff still,
We love him.
He's a good friend of ours and all that.
Happier for him, really, because some of the stuff we're writing now, what we were trying to write in time that he's in the band was more melodic. Some of the songs that we recorded with Butch are like what I was saying earlier, kind of like Leonard Cohen, Matty Pressa, acoustic stuff. Just a couple of songs, we're just kind of experimenting with more pop stuff. But I mean, we're not totally changing over. It's just that Jason didn't like that idea. I don't think. He just wanted to play more heavy. He liked the heavier, grungier stuff. And we had a few songs that we hadn't recorded that he really liked, and we didn't want to do them. Mainly, I didn't want to do them because I'm such a dictator. And it just didn't. So we were a 3-piece for 2 years before, so it's no big deal. I mean, we wanted another guitar player because I'm such a shitty guitar player that I couldn't really be that great of a front man and play guitar. But now that I've studied tablature and guitar world makes, I've gotten a lot better.
We also arpeggios.
Yes, Chad. Oh, it's awesome. You're the next to go.
I'm next on the list, by the way.
Ironically, Chad was the next to go. This interview took place on April 18th of 1990. By June of 1990, Chad was gone. Chad was Nirvana's drummer from May of 1988 until June of 1990. Jason Everman was Nirvana's second guitar player from February to July of 1989.
I came to the point where I realized I wasn't going to be allowed to participate in songwriting, not anything more than a side guy, which is fun,
That was from an interview Jason Everman did with Music Life Radio in September of 2010. Jason Everman and Chad Channing knew each other long before Nirvana. They went to elementary school together. As a matter of fact, it was Chad who introduced Jason to Kurt and Krist.
through being friends with Chad, that's how I met Kurt and Krist. I remember at one point hanging out with them, Kurt broached the idea of adding a second guitar player. I think mainly just to augment them live, not so much in the studio. And I was like, yeah, he gave me a demo tape. I went home, learned the songs. And Nirvana was interesting because at that time they didn't really rehearse. And I think that was just a function of Kurt and Krist lived in one town, Chad lived in another, and I lived in another, and it was just logistically complicated.
It's a real hassle to get up around this. I live in the capital of Washington State, Olympia.
I live in Tacoma, Washington. Muscle cars and crack cocaine. He's a deer farmer.
Frolics naked in the grass with deer.
I do.
Feeds them berries.
There's like a ferry boat that connects me to the world of Seattle.
It was Jason who paid for Nirvana's first album to be produced. Bleach was made with Jason's money. Kurt, Krist, and Chad didn't have the cash to pay for the studio. Neither did their record label at the time, Sub Pop. More on that a bit later. So it was Jason who paid the bill and saved the day, even though he doesn't actually appear on Bleach. The total cost was $606.17.
At that point, I'd been working as a commercial fisherman in Alaska for several seasons and had some money in the bank and was asked to finance the record, and I said, sure.
In a few minutes, I'm going to share with you the rest of that Jason Everman interview. But first, I want to share with you a few minutes of my interview with Bruce Pavitt, the co-founder of Sub Pop, Nirvana's first record label, where he talks about Jason Everman and the financing situation for Bleach. Nirvana recorded Bleach at a studio called Reciprocal Recordings.
Kurt called me and said, we're about to go on Reciprocal and we need you guys to cover the bill. And I had the audacity, and this is actually very embarrassing, to say, could you front me the money? You know, okay, the record label's supposed to come up with the cash, but like, just, can you guys cover it? We'll hit you later. That's how broke we were. And he basically hung up on me. But this second guitarist, Jason Everman, who didn't really play on the record, wound up paying the bill. You know, they went into the studio and he wound up covering the bill. But I do remember Kurt asking me to come up with $600, and I didn't. You know what? And here's the trippy part of the story. Sub Pop never came up with that money, the $600. So when I said a $600 record that sells a couple million copies, I said that's a good investment. Well, the punchline to that story is we actually spent zero. So it was a zero investment and sold 2 million copies. So that might be the best, you know, most profitable record in the history of the music business, if you look at it that way. We did, I will say this, that on the second edition of Bleach, a lot of people don't know this, the first edition had, the first 1,000 were white copies. The second edition were black, but we had a huge fold-out poster of Jason Everman. That was our way of saying, thanks for paying for the recording, bro.
Did you have any kind of working relationship with Jason Everman when he was in Nirvana?
Not really. He's pretty noted as kind of a serious guy, a little sullen. Definitely rocked, took things very seriously. I thought it was good, you know. When Nirvana played the Moore Theater in Seattle with 1,500 people at the Sub Pop Showcase, the Lame Fest, June 9th of 1989, Jason Everman got on stage. And if you see any of the shows from that tour, you can really see it coming together. You know, he definitely added a lot of punch to the band, but just didn't work out.
I'm going to show you more of that interview a bit later. Going back to Jason, here Jason talks about how he actually wanted to be a drummer growing up, but ended up playing guitar simply because it was too much money to buy a drum set. And also his parents didn't want someone drumming in the house.
Initially, I wanted to get a drum set and be a drummer. And I think in a lot of ways, I'm still kind of a frustrated drummer. But drum set was just too, as a bridge too far, man. It was too much money, and I don't think my parents would have ever tolerated me banging on drums after school. So I went to the guitar just because it was economically that was, you know, what worked. I just started plinking around, listening to my Kiss records, AC/DC, stuff like that, and trial and error, you know, figuring out the guitar.
Shortly after leaving Nirvana, Jason joined Soundgarden as their bassist. He replaced their original bassist, Hiro Yamamoto, after he quit the band. Jason was in the band from about September of 1989 till approximately May or June of 1990.
Well, he was in this band, Nirvana, Violet Record. They're an amazing Seattle band, and we were huge fans of theirs. And simultaneously, at the time that our bass player quit, he left Nirvana, so we asked him if he wanted to check it out. He was already a big fan. He learned all of our recorded songs in a few weeks, and when we chose him, all we had to do was just go play. It's really easy.
Unlike Nirvana, where we still don't know definitively if Jason quit or if he was fired, with Soundgarden, he was fired. Jason said the following in 2023 about being fired from Soundgarden. Quote, "It's complicated, but at the end of the day, I wasn't getting along with Chris Cornell that well, and obviously who's gonna go? It was me. It broke my heart. Getting fired from Soundgarden put me in a pretty bad tailspin. It was a pretty rough patch in my life for sure, because I loved that band. I never thought they would get as big as they did. Honestly, it was surprising, because they were a great band, but I always thought they were a little too quirky to be huge, despite the Chris Cornell factor. I always thought they were a little too weird to have mainstream success, which was fine with me. I thought they'd be a big indie band like Sonic Youth." End quote. Now, really interestingly, according to Kurt Cobain's longtime girlfriend, Tracy Miranda, after Jason Everman was fired as the bassist in Soundgarden, Kurt was interested in possibly auditioning to be the bass player in Soundgarden. This is from Greg Prado's book, Grunge is Dead. Quote, "Kurt loved Soundgarden. At one point, when they were looking for another bassist, I think maybe when Ben Shepherd joined the band, Kurt actually thought about quitting Nirvana. He wanted to try out for Soundgarden because he liked them that much." End quote. Now, imagine how interesting it would have been if not only Kurt had joined Soundgarden as their bassist, but also if he had joined right after Soundgarden parted ways with Jason Everman. I mean, depending on how you look at it, Jason is either one of the luckiest or unluckiest people in the history of the grunge scene. Here he is discussing his relationship with Chad Channing and how him and Chad were actually in a band together before Nirvana.
I've known Chad since 6th grade. He was in my homeroom in 6th grade. Chad was exotic and cool because in 6th grade he had long hair and a mustache. I don't think I played in a formal band until maybe 85, like my junior year of high school, with actually Chad Channing. And we had this band called Stone Crow. It was fun. That was like the first band, like actually loaded up the van and went to Seattle and supported like national punk bands on tour and stuff. So that was kind of my first exposure to playing live.
It sounds like your friendship with Chad Channing was the reason that you were able to get into Nirvana.
Yeah, that was definitely it. Well, I remember seeing Nirvana, and they were called Skid Row. I think they went through a couple different name permutations, but I think the first time I saw them was at the Community World Theater in Tacoma, like in 88 maybe. And the reason I got interested is because a friend of mine was like, "Oh, you need to check out Dale Crover's new band." Because at the time, Dale was playing drums with Kurt and Krist. I don't know at what point Chad ended up in the band or what the mechanism was for that. The first time I played with them live was a dorm party at the Evergreen State College in Olympia, this dorm called K-Dorm.
Can you describe your time with Nirvana, the types of gigs that you would play with them?
Did like a West Coast tour and then the first U.S. tour. The first U.S. tour was, it's the classic indie rock van tour. Load up all the gear, get in the van, play to spotty shows in the smaller towns and maybe bigger turnouts in the bigger towns. But playing a show and then afterwards, you have enough money to buy gas in the next town or buy something to eat. What do you do?
In terms of early Nirvana tour stories, during the last 40 minutes or so of this video, I'm going to share with you quotes from Chad Channing, where he reflects on touring with Nirvana, his history with the band, and much more.
So what was like the first songs you guys ever jammed on?
Floyd the Barber, Spank Through. We had a song called Ranchola. It was really weird.
We had a song called Aero Zeppelin.
We had a song called Aero Zeppelin. We did.
We were more punk rock at the time, kind of like scratch acid rip-offs. I was into hard rock before I was into punk rock, like at Led Zeppelin and Aerosmith and stuff like that, or Motorhead.
Jason Everman was a hard rock heavy metal guy, so it's interesting to hear Kurt talk about how he was really into those kind of bands before he got into punk. Perhaps if Kurt's musical taste had remained more on the heavy metal hard rock side, Jason would have remained in Nirvana. To this day, it's not 100% clear whether Jason quit the band or whether he was fired. Different sources say different things. For Kurt's part, he said in this interview with journalist Mike Hibarger that it was them who removed Jason.
During the week that we kicked him out, he tried out for Soundgarden. It worked out awesome.
For his part, Jason said that he left the band. He actually said he felt relieved when things ended with Nirvana.
I mean, I honestly just felt kind of relieved. It was getting stressful towards the end.
In any case, the following is a quote from Kurt where he discusses Jason and Nirvana parting ways. I believe this quote is from 1990. Quote, "It was very mutual. I don't really want to elaborate on it. It was just musical differences. We're really glad it worked out the way it did. He really did keep the band together. It gave me more freedom to jump around into the crowd in the middle of the solo, stuff like that. Get a little bit more wild. I'm becoming a lot more comfortable playing by myself, so we really don't need another guitarist. It's very rare to get people as really compatible as we are, the three of us." Jason Everman didn't actually play on Bleach. He was a good friend who contributed money to pay for the recording of Bleach. In return, we credited him as a guitarist and put him in the picture in the album. Nirvana has always been a three-piece band, even on Bleach. Chad Channing just wanted to leave, although I'm not sure why. But we're still friends, even though we don't keep in touch very often these days. When Chad left, we looked for a drummer and found Dave Grohl, who I think is the best drummer I could ever find. He was playing in a hardcore band called Scream, and he's simply the best, the most incredible drummer I've ever seen. As per Jason, we met Jason maybe a couple of months before we recorded Bleach and really liked him and started hanging out with him. So I started thinking that maybe I like to do a bit more singing and didn't want to worry about guitar playing that much. End quote. It's interesting to hear Kurt say that Chad left the band and he's not sure why, when in reality, Kurt has said at least a few times publicly that Chad was fired from the band. Though in any case, very similar to the Jason situation, Chad departing ways with Nirvana was very much a mutual thing. Just like Jason, Chad was not happy that he wasn't able to contribute songwriting-wise towards Nirvana. Added to the mix, Kurt felt Chad's drumming style wasn't the best for Nirvana anymore, and it was one of those things where both sides just felt like this was the end of the road. I'll be exploring what happened between Nirvana and Chad in much more detail later on in this video. But first, I want to show you something I think is kind of cool. At Nirvana's concert on October 30th, 1993, about half a year before Kurt died, Kurt thought he saw Chad in the crowd. This concert took place at the Hara Arena near Daytona, Ohio, which is on the other side of the country from Seattle, from Bainbridge Island, so it was already unlikely Chad would be there in the first place. Eventually, it turned out he wasn't there, but Kurt thought he was. And so, in front of a crowd of thousands of fans, Kurt gave Chad a pretty cool shout-out.
Chad, where the hell are you? We really want you to come up here. So, try to make it over. I don't know where they wanted you to come, on this side or that side, I don't remember, but try to come over, okay? We're not playing until you come up here. Hey Chad, now we're really sorry if we freaked you out or embarrassed you or anything. We'd really like you to come backstage and say hi to us after the show. But we'd really like you to play a song. We'd like you to play School with us if you could.
In a few minutes, I'm going to get back to the Jason Everman story. But first, as you heard Kurt say, School appears on Nirvana's first album, Bleach. That album was produced by Jack Endino. And Nirvana's next album, Nevermind, was produced by Butch Vig. However, were it not for a scheduling issue, Jack Endino may have produced Nevermind. Nevermind was recorded from May to June of 1991, but a year earlier, from April 2nd to 6th of 1990, Nirvana recorded 8 songs with Butch Vig. That was the first time they worked with him. Interestingly, as you'll hear in a minute from Kurt himself, the only reason they didn't work with Jack Endino for this April session is because Jack was busy. Now, the reason this ties into Nevermind is because 5 of the 8 songs they recorded in April of 1990 were re-recorded for Nevermind. Those 5 songs are Breed, In Bloom, Stay Away, Lithium, and Polly. And so, if Jack had done the original April 1990 versions of those songs, there's a much higher chance that he would have been hired to work on Nevermind. For those of you who are curious, the other 3 songs from the April 1990 session were Dive, Sappy, and Here She Comes Now. This session, the April 1990 session, was supposed to produce the final recordings that were to appear on Nirvana's next album. They weren't supposed to be re-recorded a year later for Nevermind. Here's what happened. In 1988, Nirvana signed with Sub Pop, an independent record label based in Seattle. Sub Pop did not have the commercial outreach that the major record labels have. Sub Pop was supposed to release the April of 1990 sessions as the next Nirvana album. But what Kurt and Krist did without Sub Pop knowing is they sent those April of 1990 sessions to various major labels in order to generate interest in signing Nirvana to a major label contract. And that's exactly what happened. In late 1990, Nirvana left Sub Pop and signed with the major label DGC, the David Geffen Company. In this clip I'm going to show you, when Kurt talks about the new Nirvana record, he's referring to the April of 1990 session.
The next record is recorded, or
some of it, about 7 songs. We did it with Butch Vig.
Oh yeah?
Yeah.
How did that work out?
Thumbs up. It really worked out well.
Oh yeah? In Madison?
Yeah.
You recorded it with Butch, and you were going to record like 3 more songs back in Seattle?
Yeah. When we write them.
When you record with Jack and Dino, what's that like?
It's a constant battle. He beats the shit out of us. Yeah. He's a real fucker. He's a great guy. Beautiful person.
Lays it out.
What does he do for your sound?
No, it's a secret. He wanted to tell us. He just he works well. We don't know.
One thing I noticed about the last record is it could have all sounded like really samey, but it doesn't.
Really what?
Similar? Yeah. Well, see, some of the songs, 2 or 3 songs were recorded with Dale Crover of the Melvins. So those were different sessions. Those were about a year earlier than that.
Love Buzz was at a different session.
Yeah, Love Buzz was a different session.
Big Cheese.
So he sort of had a small idea what we were looking for, I suppose.
What direction are you headed? More records with Sub Pop?
Yeah, well, we signed a contract for 3 records. So we've got 2 more. But we could always change our name, go to a major.
In about 10 minutes, I'm going to share with you audio of Kurt discussing the contract they signed with DGC, the David Geffen Company. And I'm also going to go over more of Jason Everman's history with Nirvana. But first, here's the crazy backstory as to how Nirvana left Sub Pop for DGC. A very drunk, very angry Krist Novoselic actually saved Sub Pop from going bankrupt. When Nirvana left Sub Pop in 1990, Bruce and Jonathan were devastated. Bruce Pavitt and Jonathan Poneman are the 2 co-founders of Sub Pop. However, as Bruce said to me in this interview clip I'm going to share with you, Nirvana leaving Sub Pop actually saved the record label from going bankrupt. Nevermind was released by DGC on September 24th of 91. In August of 91, Sub Pop had only $100 left in their bank account. But when Nevermind exploded, Sub Pop got millions of dollars in royalties. The crazy thing is, they only got those royalties because of a contract a very angry Krist Novoselic forced Sub Pop to sign back in 1989. Bruce explains the whole story here.
What was the, legal process like getting Nirvana off of Sub Pop and onto DGC?
Well, what happened was, I'll give you the story. In 89, the summer of 89, a few months after Bleach had been out, Krist Novoselic came to my house and in a fairly aggressive way insisted we sign them to an actual contract. Okay, which saved our ass in the end, right? It was a total miracle because I was not at my house. I was next door at a party. And I thought, I'm going to step on the porch and get some fresh air. And I stepped on the porch to get some fresh air. And I saw Krist walking towards the house. And I'm like, what's up? And, just to color the situation, he'd been drinking. So it was a scary moment where he was like, we're getting a contract, and we went upstairs and we talked and I was trying to chill him out. So it was a miracle that we even crossed paths because if I hadn't stepped out for that fresh air, he would have came to my house, probably would have got home, sobered up. And whether we would get a contract or not, I don't know if that ever happened. At that time in the 80s, typically indie labels didn't work with contracts. They didn't have money for attorneys, right? So it was always a handshake deal. So we had no money for an attorney, so I called Poneman. He went to the library, he Xeroxed or photocopied a boilerplate contract, filled in Nirvana, cost us 10 cents, right? They come in, they sign it, and because we had that contract, when Nirvana decided to jump to a major label using the recording of their second album that we thought we were going to release, but what we didn't know is that they were sending that out as a demo to major labels. DGC stepped in and said, we're taking these guys, just going to have to deal with it, but we'll negotiate, a settlement. So it was kind of a bittersweet moment, but because they were signed to 2 more records, we got royalties from In Utero and Nevermind, so that really totally saved our ass. There's money coming into the label. We're signing new acts, like literally millions of dollars are pouring in, whereas, like I said, we had less than $100 in August of 91. That all changed within 6 months. We're rehiring, we're re-signing. Bleach is going through the roof. We sell 1 million copies of Bleach. Again, millions of dollars are coming in. So that was all exciting. And then for us, the mania that happened in Seattle, you'd have camera crews coming in from Spain. And of course, we had an office, so they could always get an interview with us. And I remember doing like an interview a day for at least a year because the Seattle grunge thing was blowing up. So it was ridiculous. It was exciting. It was a little weird, but ultimately it was an amazing, amazing time.
At the end of this clip, Bruce talks about a conversation he had with Kurt on January 11th of 92. That was the day Nevermind topped Michael Jackson's album Dangerous as the #1 album in America on the US Billboard charts. That same day, Nirvana played on Saturday Night Live. This was when Nirvana mania was really hitting its peak, and Bruce discusses what Kurt's emotional state was like on that day, and in general how he was feeling about the newfound fame he had. But first, Bruce shares the pretty funny story of how he was kind of in denial about Nirvana leaving Sub Pop.
I was really pretty oblivious. It's my understanding Kurt made up his mind, but still, in my mind, I literally couldn't imagine them doing that, even though I went through this whole process. John's like, I think major labels are looking at them. I was literally just still interpreting that as like, those are just rumors. And I think he was way more savvy on that than I was. And in fact, that summer, he had me go visit them in Las Vegas when they were touring with Sonic Youth. And I go to Las Vegas, and in the dressing room, there's a couple of guys from DGC. And it's a little strange, but I'm like, oh, the DGC guys are here, and we're chit-chatting. And, in retrospect, it's just totally obvious what was going on. But I think I just didn't think they would actually do it, that they would stay indie because they were very punk in spirit. And at that time, very few bands did that. So it was almost inconceivable to me that they would actually do that. John said, visit Kurt and tell him he's got to stick with Sub Pop, convince him to stay with the label. And I did. I brought him some records of outsider artists like Daniel Johnston, Hi, How Are You? I gave him that album. You later see him wearing that T-shirt everywhere. Well, yeah. that was a gift, and it was my way of saying we are always going to support the outsiders. Corporations are not going to do that. So we are going to respect your creativity and support Nirvana. But he also knew we were pretty broke at the time.
So when did you first realize that Nirvana was in fact going to leave the label?
Well, I will tell you, they did a show in September at this garage. It's kind of an infamous show. I'm trying to remember the name of this garage.
The Motorsports?
Motorsports garage. Thank you. The Motorsports show was kind of their last indie Sub Pop related show. And unbeknownst to Danny Peters, who was drumming with them, they had already decided that they were going to bring in Dave Grohl. I didn't know anything about the Grohl situation. Sub Pop had just put out a single, Sliver and Dive by Nirvana. And Nirvana just kept telling us, hey, we need some time before we put out the album, so here's a single. So that's what they're telling me, right? And I'm just taking that at face value. So it was right after that show, somebody basically said, we're seeing Nirvana riding around in limos. You know that, right? You know everybody's courting them. And I'm still like, no, it's not happening. It was just like this weird psychological thing. And finally somebody said, dude, they signed to DGC. And I think I kind of snapped. I remember being just profoundly sad, like that it sunk in that, yes, this is happening. It's kind of like you hear maybe your girlfriend's cheating on you and you're like, no, that wouldn't happen. And then next thing you know, you don't have a girlfriend anymore. It's a little bit like that, and the mind does funny things when it doesn't want to deal with reality.
But then, obviously it has that Cinderella ending when they blew up and it kind of, saved the label.
Right? It does. So it really worked for everybody in a way. But see, there's just so many layers to the story. And this is where I'm going to get a little sad here with Kurt. He's no longer with us, So there's so many different ways of looking at the story. But ultimately, it's safe to say that they had a tremendous cultural impact. I will say that the last time I really had a good conversation with Kurt was at a key point in their career, was after their set that they played Saturday Night Live. They played Saturday Night Live like the second Saturday in January. Their record had just knocked Michael Jackson off the #1 spot. It was kind of the peak of the explosion. They play Saturday Night Live. So they're selling 400,000 records a week. And I went backstage after the show and I got to hang out with Kurt. And it was just him and me talking. And he was really glad to see me. And you could tell that he was just in an ecstatic state that they were achieving so much success. And he told me how much he wanted to open a petting zoo for children. And, he had all these fantasies and stuff he was going to do with his cash. And he goes, kids are asking me for my autograph. And even though supposedly Nirvana didn't do autographs, that was kind of a thing you would hear. He specifically told me that he was honored. He was enjoying being a rock star. He was straight up. It was like, kids are asking me for autographs. It's cool. It was good. He was in a really good place.
One of the craziest parts about Nevermind blowing up is that no one expected it to. Not even Nirvana's new label, DGC. As of this posting, Nevermind has sold about 30 million copies worldwide, and the songs from Nevermind have billions upon billions of streams online. Yet, at the time of its release, DGC only made 46,251 copies of Nevermind, and DGC thought Nevermind might sell up to about 250,000 copies. But just in its first year, Nevermind is estimated to have sold roughly 4 million copies. Now, although DGC, the David Geffen company, really wanted to sign Nirvana, they didn't offer them a very big signing contract. The following is Kurt in November of '91 after the release of Nevermind, discussing the deal they signed with Geffen.
We weren't offered very much money, very small amount compared to most bands that sign, which is good because then we can recoup the money that we sell off the record. A lot of bands get this big, huge advance, like $1 million, and then they're, if they don't sell enough records, they're in debt to the label forever. They can break up within a year, and then they still are having to work at gas station jobs and pay off the label. The money that is basically just a loan. If we didn't go that route, we could have. There were a few labels that were offering us a lot of money, but they weren't the right label. I'm really happy with DGC. They approached us like all the other labels, and we took a tour of their offices, and it was very like a community type of place. It's just like a big house. And the main reason why we signed them is because a lot of people who work in the alternative department have worked at independent labels. We just wanted to make sure we had really good distribution and people could find our records, because we were tired of kids coming up to us at shows and saying, we can't find your record anywhere. The fact that we're on a major label, commercial radio stations in America will only play bands that are on major labels. So I know that just for the fact that we were on a major label had a lot to do with it.
That was from an interview conducted on November 21st, 1991. It was done in Paris, France by journalists Anne-Catherine and Vivian Vogue. At the time, Nirvana was in the midst of touring Europe as part of the release for Nevermind. Nevermind had just come out 2 months earlier on September 24th of 91. The following is from the same interview where Kurt reflects on whether he was expecting Nevermind to become as big as it did.
Oh no, absolutely not. Not the scale that it's gone to. We were aware of the anticipation of the album, but there was no really collective promotional scheme. It was very organic. Also, I'm pretty convinced that the programmers, the people responsible for playing in the radio, are sincerely into our music. I think they really like it. We've been told that when we go back to the States and we start playing again, we'll be playing in front of like 10 to 20,000 people at an average show. We've played a few larger places, and it isn't that impersonal as long as you still feel the spirit of everyone, and you can tell that everyone really likes it. But if it gets too big, we'll just simply break up. If it starts becoming a job, we can always do something else. Just break up, write different songs. It's really easy to destroy a career if you don't like it anymore, you know? I mean, you can simply just break up. We'd still play music together because we're good friends and we like to write songs. Hopefully we have enough common sense or intuition to know when we stop writing good songs, you know? A lot of bands don't realize that. They just keep milking it for years and years.
When it came to songwriting, of course, Kurt was by far Nirvana's principal songwriter. He basically wrote every single Nirvana song by himself. A notable exception would be Smells Like Teen Spirit, which was written by Kurt, Krist, and Dave. In any case, as discussed earlier, songwriting was one of the issues with both Jason Everman and Chad Channing. Neither Jason or Chad were getting the chance to really contribute songwriting-wise to the band. The following is another quote from Jason Everman where he discusses how the songwriting situation was one of the main issues that led to his departure from Nirvana. Quote, Chad, who is a great songwriter in his own right, had a song idea that was summarily dismissed. After that, I didn't really consider throwing any of my ideas into the ring. I always felt kind of peripheral. I don't remember ever being asked for input on songs in that band, which is ultimately why I left. I probably wanted to do things that were not simple enough for them, ideas that were mine as opposed to Kurt's. There wasn't a tremendous musical difference, maybe it was just a control thing. Basically, anybody besides Kurt or Krist is kind of disposable. At the end of the day, Kurt could get in front of any bass player or any drummer and play his songs, and it's not going to sound that much different. I think the musical artistic difference was a friction point between us, and probably something that would have most likely led to me leaving the band at a later time anyway. That, and the fact that I would have been shut out creatively. I think that the popular narrative is that I was this knuckle-dragging heavy metal guy who just didn't get it. But that's not an accurate assessment. At the end of the day, I just wasn't a good fit for Nirvana, and this is borne out in the way events took place. I never look back on the split with regret. I appreciate the experiences that I had with Nirvana, both the good and the bad. End quote. Things came to a head in July of 1989 during Nirvana's US East Coast tour. Well, not just the US, they also had a show planned in Toronto, Canada as well. But the point is that there were several shows left on this tour and Nirvana cancelled them. The band's last ever show with Jason Everman was July 18th of 1989 at the Pyramid Club in New York City. After that show, due to a combination of exhaustion, deteriorating relationships, etc., the band cancelled the rest of the tour. However, as you'll hear from the Jason Everman quote, which I'm going to continue now, he was actually surprised that the tour got cancelled, even though he himself was no longer happy in Nirvana. He thought they would at least finish the tour. Quote, By the time we got to the Northeast, things were strained. I'm generally quiet by nature, but was probably talking less by that point. The fact that there was a lack of communication during these last days of that tour is probably the salient feature of that event. I was definitely done, and I told Chad in most likely those same words. I'm sure Kurt and Krist were done as well. The he said, she said quality of these accounts are obvious and tired. I think that the most objective way to sum it up is that it was implicitly mutual. I didn't think that the Pyramid show would be my last show with Nirvana, however. I assumed that we would suck it up and finish the tour. What stands out most for me in retrospect was when they dropped me off in the alley behind my house in Seattle. I didn't believe I would see any of those guys again, even Chad, and I was at peace with that. I went into my room, dropped my pack and guitar on the floor, and just felt completely relieved. In a sense, I was free. End quote.
So how did you guys meet?
Kurt and I originally lived in a small community in Washington, and we just kind of found each other.
There's not too many people in that small community who like punk rock.
Yeah. It's like,
is it too hard?
You meet somebody, oh, this is just another one of those fucking geeks, you know? Hey, man.
The following is from the interview Kurt did with MTV in December of '93. where he discusses his relationship with Krist Novoselic, the first songs they worked on, and more.
Can you tell us about when you and Chris first met? Is it true it took a while for you to get him involved in doing something?
Yeah, for a long time. I knew him for at least 3 years before we started playing seriously in a band together. But we had, like, side bands with Buzz and the Melvins, other members of the Melvins and friends of ours in that area. We got together and played in a few bands, like the Stiff Woodies. We'd play at local jock kegs, you know. We'd put Knox gel in our hair, like GBH, and go and play live music at these shows, and I mean at these parties, and it was great, you know. We freaked everybody out. But everyone was so drunk that they didn't care about our appearance. They just wanted live music.
So what was it that finally made you? I mean, I guess which is Chris didn't want to be in a band, right?
I don't think he ever really had very many aspirations to be in a band, really. He just liked playing guitar. I knew he had a guitar for years. But Dale Crover, the drummer for the Melvins, and I made a demo in like 85, late 85, at my aunt's house on a 4-track. And I had the tape for about a year or so. And I was always trying to push it on my friends, you know, to try to get them into starting a band with me. And one day Chris, after probably hearing it a few times, just decided, hey, this is pretty good, you know. So finally the hint worked, you know.
Was that just, I was asking Chris about this earlier, he wasn't sure. Did you play bass on that as well, or was it just guitar and drums and that was it?
I played a little bit of bass on it, and Dale played bass on the other parts, some of the other songs.
That was Fecal Matter, right?
Yeah. That was my band, my imaginary band.
Yeah. Do you remember the first time you played together? Did it click right away, or is it, I mean, I guess just because you had similar tastes in music, it might have, but...
I think it clicked in a way where just the fact that we were actually playing music, and I heard these songs with a full band for the first time, it was just so amazing, you know, to actually play, I mean, I'd heard these songs because they were recorded, but all the instruments were dubbed, you know, and to play them live in a room, you know, it was amazing. It was like the most incredible thing I've ever done, and I'd been wanting to do it for years, you know. I mean, I was like 6 years overdue of already having a guitar and wanting to play with other people, but I could never get anything past like some guy that plays drums, and he'd bring his drum set over to my house, and I'd start playing this raunchy music, and they'd leave, you know. I could never get anyone to stay more than a day or a few hours.
Was he playing him the way you pictured them being played, or did he just add something more to it that you liked even better, or how was it? What was your first reaction to him playing?
To his playing, he basically played the same notes that were on the tape already. We basically just played the songs that were on the tape, on the Fecal Matter tape. So, yeah. I mean, he's added stuff. He's added his own style to the band now since we've started writing songs together. But initially we were just playing those songs off that tape.
What was the first thing you did together? Was it Hairspray Clean, or did he actually, I mean, it went from beginning with...
Oh, the first song that we wrote together? Yeah. I don't know.
I think you thought it was Hairspray Clean.
It could have been, yeah. But even at that time, when we first started writing songs, I would come up with the bass lines and everything. I would show everyone what to play, because I was still writing songs, you know, on my own time. But that was probably one of the first songs that I had written at that time, and we started to practice with as a band.
Krist Novoselic is the unsung hero of Nirvana. Kurt Cobain, rightfully so, is the first name people think of. Then there's Dave Grohl, who's a superstar in his own right. And so Krist Novoselic basically becomes the middle child. He's the overlooked sibling of the band. Yes, of course, there were other members of Nirvana. I've mentioned several times, for instance, that I think it's ridiculous Chad Channing was not inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame with Kurt, Krist, and Dave. But of those three, Kurt Cobain, Krist Novoselic, and Dave Grohl. Krist is the one who's overlooked, despite the fact his relationship with Kurt Cobain was so important to the survival and development of Nirvana. Kurt and Krist were the only two members of Nirvana to be with the band from the very beginning to the very end. They started the band together as teenagers in Aberdeen, Washington. In this video, I'm going to take a deep dive into the history of Krist Novoselic and Kurt Cobain's relationship. Now, first and foremost, how did Krist end up in Aberdeen, Washington, Kurt Cobain's hometown? Unlike Kurt, Krist isn't originally from there. He's from Compton. Yes, that Compton. Krist Novoselic was born in Compton, California on May 16, 1965. He's about 2 years older than Kurt, who was born on February 20th, 1967. The Novoselic family moved to Aberdeen in 1979. However, shortly after, Krist's parents sent him to Croatia for a year. Upon returning to Aberdeen, Kurt and Krist eventually found each other and would literally go on to change music history. I'm going to share with you a quote now from Krist Novoselic from 1992, where he discusses how Nirvana has changed his life financially. In this quote, Krist also touches on his childhood. This is from the book Cobain on Cobain. Quote, I was born in Compton, California. I'm from straight outta Compton. Eventually, my family moved from Compton to San Pedro, California, about 20 minutes south. Then we moved to Aberdeen, Washington in 1979. I freaked out on the move, so my parents sent me to Croatia for a year. Croatia was really nice. People were very down to earth there. School was a real experience, very serious. You have a lot more courses you need to take in Croatia than in American schools. It's a pretty neat place, but in any case, after a year, I moved back to Aberdeen. There was kind of a little scene in Aberdeen. The people who didn't fit in and who liked punk rock music, we had our own parties. We did our own thing. In terms of Nirvana, so much has happened to me in the past year, it's like winning the lottery. Go buy a house, go indulge in materialistic acquisitions. My wife and I were always poor. The end of the month would always be stressful. Gotta keep the lights on, gotta pay the rent. There was all this car insurance, etc., but now I've been alleviated of all those financial burdens. It's been said that the only good thing about having money is that you don't need to worry about it anymore. So I guess I'm pretty happy if I don't lose it all tomorrow. Hard to say. But if I truly was the anti-materialist that I claim to be, I'd be happy living in a wooden hut in the woods. Right now, as a band, we're just kind of taking it easy, laying around and sleeping in.
We're just working class guys. We're not going to become materialistic and screwed up. Nothing will change my mind. I'm really sure about that. Yeah, success has been a huge pressure on us, but there comes a time when suddenly you decide to move on. The root of all of this is the music we do, and that is still something that comes exclusively from inside us. Once we'd got our heads together and gotten our position straight, it was different. Personally, I think I feel much better now. I can be a lot more relaxed about things, you know? I'm grateful for everything that happened to us, as well as the position I'm in personally thanks to these events. What I appreciate most of all is that this time we've had direct and privileged access to the media. Our music is still the same, but the media are introducing us to a lot of people now. That allows us to expose our ideas and views to a huge audience. Today, I can communicate with a lot of people on a lot of topics, something that was impossible before. My private life hasn't changed, at least not greatly. Materially, I have a much more comfortable existence. I can see other places, I can do things that a year ago I would never have imagined. For a long time, we were stuck in a corner about to take off but never did. But we had a lot of promise. And now our fans have quintupled. A very big thing happened to Nirvana, the biggest thing that can happen to a rock band. We're like the buds that have blossomed. We've grown, things have become more grounded. All that's left to find out is where we'll go after this.
End quote. Krist Novoselic was instrumental in the formation of Nirvana, not just as a member, but also sort of as a landlord. Kinda. Nirvana's first real practice location, the spot in Aberdeen where the band would rehearse in the early days, was at Krist Novoselic's mother's workplace. Krist Novoselic's mom was a hairstylist with her own salon. In the early days of Nirvana, the band would practice in the empty apartment above the Novoselic's hair salon. I visited this location on my trip to Aberdeen back in 2020. Here it is.
This pink building is the old location of Maria's hair design in Aberdeen, which was run by Krist Novoselic's mother, Maria. Krist Novoselic and Kurt Cobain both went to Aberdeen High School and became friends while attending Melvin's practices. Kurt wanted to start a band with Krist, but Krist wasn't initially on board. It wasn't until a few months after Kurt Cobain and Dale Crover's 1986 FECAL demo matter was recorded that Krist Novoselic reciprocated and told Kurt he wanted to start a band. An empty apartment above Maria's hair design was used as their rehearsal space. Now, before I go further, I want to mention that I did speak with two of the tenants living here, and they both said they were cool with me taking a few shots of the building, so thank you to them. The location of this building is on 107 South Main Street in Aberdeen, and if you look at Google Maps, you'll see that it actually used to be green, so who knows what color it may have been when Nirvana was here. Now, the location for the old Maria's Hair Design building is just off of the main street, which runs through downtown Aberdeen. The main street in Aberdeen is Wishka Street. The old Maria's Hair Design building is located on South M Street, just to the right of Wishka. I should mention, by the way, that if you are planning on visiting Aberdeen, make sure to note that Wishka is a one-way street. Leaving my hotel, I almost turned the wrong way onto Wishka, straight into traffic, before thankfully remembering it's a one-way, so just keep that in mind if you are planning on visiting.
Thankfully, I didn't die. Anyways, the following is from Krist Novoselic regarding how him and Kurt Cobain would collaborate during practices. More specifically, how they would feed off each other musically and create song parts. This is also from the book Cobain on Cobain. Quote,
"He was the lead songwriter. He has the idea, like he had riffs and a vocal line he'd be hammering out. He'd be holed up somewhere by himself, hammer things out, and then he would just start busting them out at rehearsal. Sometimes it was just a riff and a vocal melody. Sometimes it was a couple of riffs, more like a song. Then it depended on what everybody else's input was. The drummer is really important. The drums kind of set a tone, a beat that tells you what kind of personality the song's going to have. And I'd put my spin on it. I'd get a hit off the song and try to do something interesting instead of just follow the guitar. I'd just go for things or come up with another part, like a bridge part or something. He'd just have the one riff and melody and I'd just bust something out. And then we'd all jump on board to that. And the next thing you know, that'd be another part of the song. A lot of it was unsaid. The band just cranked it out. But it definitely had a leader. Kurt knew what he wanted to do." End quote. I came across this quote from Krist Novoselic from May of 1992, where he discusses if Nirvana could continue, should either him or Kurt decide to leave the band. This is what Krist had to say. Quote, "Just depends on what terms we left on, because you can see a certain chemistry there in some bands where just a few of the members happen to be the center of the group because they're usually the founders of the group. No, yeah, I don't know. Kurt's kind of the main guru of the band, but he's the last one to admit that. We all have a stake in the band. I think if Dave was to leave the band, I think the band would break up because we'd never go through that thing of finding another drummer. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. It depends on the situation because that's such a broad question." End quote. Krist Novoselic was one of Kurt's closest friends, arguably his closest friend. They started the band together and were the only two members who were part of Nirvana from the beginning all the way to the end. Reflecting on Kurt and how he touched his life, Krist once said the following. It's not clear when the following quote is from, but nevertheless, here it is. Quote, "Kurt Cobain. Here's a man who he would never have, like, cleaned his kitchen, or taken out the garbage, or do those kind of chores, you know? But Kurt Cobain was not a lazy person. He wrote so much music, and he was compelled to be an artist. He was a true artist. He had a natural talent, and that's what compelled him to share so many things with so many people. I walk down the street, even tonight, people walk up to me and say, 'Nirvana changed my life.' And I think that's a testament to Kurt Cobain and the vision that he was channeling and what he put out there. And he spoke to so many people, and I owe him so much that I can't even start." End quote. Interpersonal relationships in bands can be complicated. This was certainly the case with Krist Novoselic and Kurt Cobain. According to Kurt's official biographer, Michael Azerrad, Kurt Cobain's heroin use became a sore spot between him and Krist. Krist Novoselic did not approve of what Kurt was doing. According to Michael Azerrad, Kurt began to distance himself from Krist because of this. The following is from Michael Azerrad's article for The New Yorker from September of 2021. Quote, "Krist could have been a crucial port in the storm for Kurt, but, sadly, Kurt began to push his friend away in 1990, when Krist told Kurt that he disapproved of his heroin use. They were never as close again. Things got a little better when they were rehearsing before the recording of In Utero. There was the excitement of playing new songs, working with the revered recording engineer Steve Albini, and starting a new, more artistically liberated phase of the band. But by the time they recorded the Unplugged show in New York in November of 1993, they had become distant again. Kurt surrounded himself with his wife and child and a different set of friends, several of whom were drug addicts, and Krist didn't feel welcome." End quote. Krist and Kurt were very close, and it's unfortunate to see how things played out in Nirvana. Now, at the end of this video, I'm going to show you interview clips I've done with various Nirvana people regarding Krist Novoselic. In the meantime, I'm going to be sharing with you tons of other quotes from Krist regarding Kurt and Nirvana.
But I do want to show you now a 1-minute clip of Nirvana guitar tech Ernie Bailey discussing the relationship between Kurt and Krist. He describes the two of them as Frodo and Sam. Then I'm going to show you the reaction Nirvana producer Jack Endino had to the Frodo and Sam analogy.
He's such a huge part of Nirvana. And it's like, I think Dave once said, I played in so many shows. He said, how many shows Chris played in? He said all of them. And that's really true. And I know that from stories that Chris told me, like even in the early days, Chris was doing a lot of the load-ins. Chris was very protective of Kurt. It was very much a Sam and Frodo kind of a thing. I mean, Chris really fostered Kurt's ability to do what he did. And I think that you really need these two elements. And, we tend to gravitate towards the one who's, he's the singer-songwriter who's out front. And then, and I think that Chris was perfectly happy to be in the background and let Kurt get all the attention, because it was very overwhelming for everyone. And I think he was as private of a person as Kurt was.
Ernie Bailey, and he basically, in his view, he said the best way to look at Kurt and Krist is Frodo and Sam. That's kind of how his view of them was. Do you agree with that?
Yes. That's a pretty good way to look at it, actually, in a way. Except that Sam is like twice as big. Yeah, that's an interesting way of looking at it, actually. But who is Gandalf? That's the question.
That's true.
And who is Sauron?
That is true.
The following is from Jillian G. Gar's book, Entertain Us, The Rise of Nirvana, regarding the relationship between Kurt and Krist. Quote, Kurt would finally find the musical partner he'd been looking for in Krist Novoselic. Kurt and Krist had previously jammed together as teenagers and were both in a Melvin side project called the Stiff Woodies, a name inspired by the name of a Seattle punk band, Limp Richards. That band was just like a revolving door. Just messing around, says Krist. Just having fun and drinking alcohol and jumping around and screaming, making noise. Kurt played both guitar and drums in the group, and Krist occasionally took a turn as a singer. A surviving recording of a session at Chaos, Evergreen's radio station, has him handling the lead vocals on the up-tempo breakdance boogie, enthusiastically urging the listener to, quote, party down, party up. At the time, Krist's musical ambitions were less serious than Kurt's. I was having fun, having kicks, he says. I always wanted to be in a band, but there was nobody I could be in a band with. Now that he'd returned to Aberdeen, Kurt gave Krist a copy of the Fecal Matter tape. I was dinking around the house listening to it, and I said, hey, this is really good, he recalls. I really liked it. I thought it was cool. It was good melodies and interesting. He was especially impressed with Spank Through. It's a well put together song, Krist said. It's got a hook. It's kind of unique. It sounds different. And I went, yeah, let's do it. We kind of found each other, Krist says of his musical alliance with Kurt. Just out of necessity. Just to play music together. In September of 1986, Kurt Cobain moved into a small house at 1000 East 2nd Street in Aberdeen, universally referred to as the Shack due to its dilapidated condition. It quickly became as much of a hangout for their friends as Dale Crover's home had been, with the added benefit of having no parental figures around. Krist was already Kurt's most frequent jamming partner, but it took them a while to find another member for their nascent group. They rehearsed with one friend, Bob McFadden, upstairs at Maria's Hair Design, the beauty parlor owned by Krist's mother. Other musicians came and went, as the two constantly rejigged the lineup, including who played which instrument. Sometimes, Kurt and Krist switched from their usual guitar and bass roles to drums and guitar respectively. Kurt was really good on drums, Krist recalls. They also toyed with the idea of putting together a Creedence Clearwater Revival covers band. But, like many of their ideas, it came to nothing. That was a ploy to make money, Krist explains. Play in a tavern like a bar band, but we thought we played cool songs. It was just something to do to screw around on the side. We played once or twice and got bored with it. We didn't have a whole heck of a lot of songs in our repertoire. So we'd throw in a few covers, and we weren't going to do metal covers, we thought we'd do something obscure. We like to have fun too, you know. Krist introduced the song to the group that would become an integral part of the set list for the next 6 years, Love Buzz. The song was originally recorded by the Dutch band Shocking Blue, who enjoyed an English-language US-UK hit with Venus in the early 70s. Krist found the song off a self-titled American compilation of the band's work that had been given to him by a friend who picked it up at Dill's secondhand store in Aberdeen. The whole beauty of Dill's was that everything was a buck, says Ryan.
It didn't matter what it was. Every record was $1, and so if you found a gem, you really had something, because you were only going to pay $1 for it. Ryan, of course, being Ryan Agar, a close friend of the band's. I put the record on as I was getting ready for work, and I thought, goodness, this is great, Krist recalls. And that song came on, and I was like, this is a really cool song. When Kurt came over the next day, Krist wasted no time in playing him the record. Check this song out, he said. Isn't it cool? Kurt agreed, and suggested the band do a cover of it, although they didn't bother telling Aaron it wasn't an original number. We played that song for 6 months before I even knew it was a cover, says drummer Aaron Burkhardt. I mean, it's not like we sat down and Kurt put it on and said, this is the way it goes. I just figured Kurt wrote a new song.
End quote. I'm going to share with you a few quotes now from Chad Channing regarding Kurt and Krist. As mentioned off the top, I find it ridiculous that Chad Channing was not inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame along with Kurt, Krist, and Dave. Chad was the drummer in Nirvana from parts of 1988 to 1990, the period where Nirvana released their first album, Bleach, and various other recordings, including the 1990 Nevermind demo. Quote,
Krist was the talkative one. Kurt seemed on the quiet side, almost timid. Kurt and Krist always had a pretty good relationship. It was like a special little brotherhood sort of thing. Kurt was a quiet character a lot of the time, so if something was bothering him, you'd never know it. And if he talked to anybody about it, it would always be with Krist. Those guys really cared for each other quite a bit. I remember seeing this show when they were named Bliss. You got this one guy who's really, really tall, just hammering the bass. And then there's Kurt. He had some kind of, it looked like crushed velvet, silk, purple or blue, bell-bottom pants. And I think he was wearing platform shoes. He was a really colorful character up there. He's louder than hell, screaming, and then there's Krist, who's standing the size of the Eiffel Tower on one end. I first met Kurt and Krist at a Malfunction show. They were playing the Community World Theater in Tacoma. I went there, and a friend of mine, Damon, introduced me to Kurt and Krist because they were looking for a drummer. Before that, I was in a band called Tick Dolly Row, which had actually featured Ben Shepherd, who, of course, would become part of Soundgarden. In fact, that's how Kurt and Krist heard about me. A friend of mine, John Goodmanson, had this radio show at the college station, and Tick Dolly Row went up there. As I would learn later, Kurt and Krist were listening to that show and thought, wow, that's some pretty cool stuff. The thing that lured me into their band was how simple the music was, yet with the vocal melodies was just really cool. He did a really good job of taking something simple and making it sound really, really good.
End quote. As mentioned, Chad Channing was the Bleach era drummer of the band. He also played drums on the April 1990 Nevermind demos. The following is from Chris Novoselic regarding his thoughts on Bleach versus Nevermind. This quote is from late 1991, the year Nevermind was released. This is from Cobain on Cobain. Quote,
Bleach was an 8-track recording done for $600, while Nevermind was done for thousands of dollars in a 24-track studio. And the songs, the ones on Bleach are edgier, and some are slow, doleful, and dark. Nevermind has more melodies, and there's an interplay of the vocals and the individual instruments. It's brighter and more cheerful. Our music somehow evolved. Not pop in the sense of populist, but pop like the Beatles or the Byrds. On Nevermind, there are also some riff songs like Breed and Stay Away. For us, it's simply about staying interested and not always playing the same old stuff. That would be boring. Then again, lots of bands are constantly thinking about their image, their attitude, and their sound. By contrast, we're just 3 guys who write songs. I mean, all we've done is make a record. We're not any great image band. We're not rock stars in the true sense. We're slowly getting known but aren't yet really famous. And I don't even know if we like it. I don't think we like being chased by people for autographs. What's that all about? What counts now is that we're playing live and the people are coming. They've heard the record and want to see us on stage. Bleach and Nevermind are very different records. I think each has its own value. The new one, however, is accessible to the mainstream ear as well. Thanks to Geffen's radio division, for example, we got played on the major stations, which gave the people the opportunity they'd otherwise never have had. As a result of lots of people asking, what's that? We naturally got played more often, and people bought the record. A song like Polly was written before Bleach came out. Lots of songs from Nevermind were written in the spring of 1990, like In Blue and Lithium, whereas Smells Like Teen Spirit was written 1 month before the recording session. In reality, that's the problem with labels. They take forever to put out records. Besides, the band is changing, and if you listen to the demo tape that we made in the beginning of April of 1990, you can really tell that there were already all these different elements that were there from the start. With regard to the next record, it'll certainly be more experimental. As for the difference between Bleach and Nevermind, it's that the first cost $600 and the other one cost $100,000. There's a meaning behind Teen Spirit. I think all the songs have meanings. I don't think they're meaningless or anything. I mean, I've read the lyrics off the lyric sheet and I've got a hint of what they mean. I think they're really good. I think there are plans for a lyric sheet to surface one of these days. I haven't paid much attention, so I don't know. I don't want to talk about the lyrics because they're Kurt's lyrics, but I've heard him express that he likes to keep things cryptic and open-ended. But I think he knows what the song means. The songs have meanings for me, too. They affect me personally and probably different than, say, maybe they affect you. It's the old artistic cliche. It's open for interpretation. But I remember coming up with the imagery for Teen Spirit as an anarchist high school, with cheerleaders dressed in black with the anarchy A's on their costumes. It's kind of a weird image since high school is so regimented and controlled, you know. And then you have a concept of anarchy where there is really no control and no rules. Because in high school, there's unwritten rules of social behavior and accepting people. There's written rules, of course, you know, school rules. You got to be in class on time, you can't be tardy. To have an image like that with the anarchy symbols was just a statement, really. A lot of times, maybe a song has a feel to it. I don't write the lyrics, so a lot of times I feel like the lyrics accent the feel of the song, as maybe a video should too. Come As You Are, for instance, is kind of a laid-back tune. It's got a lot of weird chords on the guitar, and you see colors like purple and magenta and what are used in the video.
End quote. Teen Spirit and Nevermind as a whole turned Nirvana into a massively commercial band. Oftentimes, Kurt, Krist, and Dave would downplay their success, partly out of concern that being a massive mainstream band would hurt their underground punk credibility. Well, in December of 1993, Krist Novoselic said the following quote I'm going to share with you. In this quote, he talks about Nirvana's future and how he sees the band going forward. Krist essentially says he's no longer going to downplay that he's happy about Nirvana's mainstream success. Krist says he sees nothing wrong with Nirvana remaining a commercial band and that he, quote, doesn't see why we should put out records that interest nobody. That's interesting foreshadowing because after this quote, I'm going to share with you something else from Krist Novoselic where he expresses the frustration he's had with his lack of musical success after Nirvana. But first, the quote from December of 93. This is from Cobain on Cobain. Quote,
When we said that Nevermind had experienced too great a success, it was out of sincere modesty, but I'm not going to say it anymore. I'm glad of everything that happened. I wouldn't want to change anything. You know, I imagined a bunch of stuff before about the independent punk rock bazaar. This humility, the embarrassment over success, being outside of the mainstream came with all that stuff. Then, being absorbed and accepted by the mainstream, it was like being swallowed up. Books, movies, music, politics, etc. Now, I step back. I scrutinize the mechanism of the music industry. It's still a big pile of garbage to me. MTV, the record labels, the press, they're all in cahoots. Everyone knows everyone, praises each other, then backstabs each other. So this is where I am now, trying to make the best music and making as much money as possible out of it. Of course, I was very idealistic before, and I still am, as a matter of fact. I try to be generous and positive. The business has changed, but things still don't go the way you would like them to. How many times did we tell ourselves that we would have liked it if this had also happened to bands other than us? Today, In Utero is number 20 in the US, and Pearl Jam are number 1. That means there is room for other bands, but basically, what have we really changed? Being excited is all we have left, jumping around, playing fast and loud, throwing our instruments in the air. The rest is routine and time to kill. Hitting the road with the bus, getting clean, and taking a break at the hotel. Before, we were just wandering in a van. Now we have a tour manager, a sound team, a production company, a precise schedule. It used to be an adventure. It doesn't feel that way anymore. But I feel no nostalgia. There is no reason we should have stopped and started again under a new name. The small stinking venues, the hassle, no. The only way forward is to continue to listen to our heart, to make music we love. It's a good thing when people buy your records, not a bad one. I don't see why we should put out records that interest nobody. Why should I go back in the dark? I have the opportunity to express myself and people buy my records through the promotion of mass media. I am very proud of our music. Why should I hide under the pretext that our music is better than 90% of the stuff that sells? I am concerned with my ability to withstand the rock music business. It's a huge industry, a mass thing. And I do not have business acumen. I only want to invest myself in my music. I do it without compromises, without lies.
End quote. Quickly, before I discuss Krist Novoselic post-Nirvana, here's one more quote from 1993 where Krist discusses the success of the band. This is from August of 93 from Cobain on Cobain. Quote,
"What happened to us has kinda opened a lot of doors. I think we were in the right place at the right time for, like, rock and roll because all those old rock stars, all those poofy-doo Hairspray bands were just hanging on and doing the same thing. Basically emulating Hanoi Rocks, like, over and over again. And it stagnated like the Soviet economy or something. You know what I mean? I walked into the Fred Meyer department store downtown in Longview, Washington, this tiny town, and I look and I go, oh, there's Mudhoney, there's Sebadoh, there's Sonic Youth. I go, this is really great. And before I think, the old dinosaurs were just like holding on for as long as possible. But then we had this really strong song, Teen Spirit, and at the time there were like no number one rock records. Maybe REM was number one and Metallica came out with good stuff, but just change had to happen, Just part of the whole human experience is change. So I think that next we're probably going to be the old hacks and there will be this young happening band going on and probably slagging us off or something for being dinosaurs. And we would have like totally consolidated our relationship with people in MTV, like music labels, different magazines. We're going to be like the establishment. And hopefully someone will come by and kill us.
End quote. Now, a little earlier, I shared a quote from Krist regarding his thoughts on if Nirvana could continue without Kurt. Well, we know that, of course, Nirvana didn't. But what exactly did the surviving members of the band do? Dave Grohl, most notably, went on to start the Foo Fighters and was joined by Pat Smear. But what about Krist? Yes, Krist has collaborated with the Foos, but unlike Pat Smear, Krist Novoselic has never been an official member. So what's Krist been up to? Well, he's dabbled in politics, he's appeared in a Robin Williams movie, he's been divorced, he's gotten remarried, and he's been involved with multiple bands. Yet, despite his massive success with Nirvana, Krist's new musical journey was struggling to really break through. Frustrated, Krist at one point even posted a statement online that he quits, that every band he's ever been in falls apart. Long story short, Krist Novoselic's journey after Nirvana is actually pretty interesting. I'll be exploring all of this right now. The following is from the 2014 book Nirvana Facts by John D. Lurson. Quote,
Nirvana altered rock music forever. As a result, the band's business and legacy continue to grow, just as the surviving members continue to evolve creatively and build new identities for themselves. Krist Novoselic and Dave Grohl made their first post-Nirvana appearance together at the Yo-Yo A-Go-Go Indie Rock Festival in Olympia in the fall of '94, backing the Stinky Puffs, the group helmed by Jad Fair's 10-year-old stepson Simon Fair-Timoney and Cody Lynn Ronaldo, the young son of Sonic Youth guitarist Lee Ronaldo. The final song of the Stinky Puffs set, I Love You Anyways, was an emotional number about Cobain penned by Timoney, who Kurt had befriended during Nirvana's last tour. Shortly after the Stinky Puffs show, Krist and Dave formed bands of their own. They would both also collaborate with other artists and pursue projects outside of music with varying degrees of success. Krist Novoselic's band Sweet 75 took shape when Krist Novoselic met Eva Las Vegas, a Venezuelan street busker his then-wife Shelly had hired to sing at his 30th birthday party. Although Krist first envisioned producing an album for Eva, they evolved into a band as they began to write songs together, with the addition initially of a drummer, Bobby Lohr. Taking their name from a poem by Theodore Rothke, they played a few Northwestern shows and, on the strength of Krist's Nirvana pedigree, signed to Geffen. The group's Paul Fox-produced album included guest appearances by REM's Peter Buck, Ainsah Romero of Sky Cries Mary, and jazz great Herb Alpert. Perhaps because of Krist's stature, critics were polite about the record. AllMusic.com's Stephen Thomas Erlewine wrote, Novoselic attempts to bring adventure and experimentation back to guitar-oriented alternative rock with Sweet 75's eponymous debut, with mixed results. It's admirable that the duo blends indie rock with heavy rock, Mexican music, lunge, and country, but the intentions are often better than the final product. End quote. Ultimately, the sales were minuscule and the band disbanded in '98. They briefly regrouped a few months later, but plans for a second album were soon scrapped. By mid-1999, Novoselic began focusing his attention on Sunshine Cake, a band he and musicians Bill Rieflin and Anissa Romero were working on. Concurrently, Krist directed his first movie, L7 The Beauty Process, a low-budget, tongue-in-cheek documentary about Nirvana's former touring partners assembled from footage that he shot on tour in '97. By the end of 1999, Krist had launched a one-off punk band called the No WTO Combo, with former Dead Kennedys frontman Jello Biafra, Soundgarden guitarist Kim Thayil, and drummer Gina Mainwall. They booked a gig at the Showbox in Seattle for the night before the World Trade Organization Summit in Seattle, but it was postponed because of the curfew zone issues and rescheduled for the following evening. A recording of the gig would ultimately see release via Biafra's alternative Tentacles label as Live from the Battle in Seattle. Jack Endino mixed the EP, which also included a 15-minute speech by Biafra. In 2002, Krist Novoselic formed Eyes Adrift with Meat Puppets frontman Kurt Kirkwood and former Sublime drummer Bud Gaw. It's been fun for us to get back to playing music, Krist said on August 27, 2002 in an interview for Rolling Stone. After all, we're musicians. We should be playing and creating music. Speaking just a few weeks ahead of the trio's debut via the now defunct New York indie label Spin Art Records on September 24, 2002, Krist was hesitant to accept Eyes Adrift being labeled as a supergroup. Citing the likes of 80s bands Asia and Mike and the Machines, he joked, "That term has a bad connotation. We've all got our past, which we're really proud of, but our future is Eyes Adrift. People have it in their heads that we got together because we all had tragic situations in our previous bands, but it was purely coincidental. That would be like saying that we all got together because we all come from trios." Novoselic explained how the trio came together after he dropped in on a solo gig that Kurt was playing in Seattle in the fall of 2001. "I was like, wow, Kurt still got it." Afterwards, I approached him about getting together to jam. Ironically, Bud, who I'd never met yet, but who was also a fan of Kurt's guitar style, was thinking the same thing after he saw Kurt playing solo down in California. So he called up Kurt to see if he'd be interested in jamming. Once we all got together, I had some songs and Kurt had some songs, and we made up some more, and it was really comfortable. Honing that new material in Kirkwood's hometown of Austin, Texas, Eyes Adrift road tested the songs during a club tour in January and February of 2002. Those gigs in venues like I Spy in Seattle, the Troubadour in LA, and Emos in Austin, in front of fans in old Nirvana, Sublime, and Meat Puppet t-shirts, were quite reassuring to Krist and the others. "How could we not feel confident in that environment?" he explained. "No one who showed up really knew what to expect from us. I hope they weren't expecting Teen Spirit or Backwater, but at the end of each show, people were into it. We didn't see anyone walk out of those shows, and for $10 or $12, we gave them real entertainment." After that preliminary tour, Eyes Adrift spent 3 weeks in an Austin studio and came away with a diverse 12-song rock and roll debut. The melodic Inquiring Minds was one of 3 songs that Novoselic sang, lashing out about the media circus that exploited the '96 death of John Benet Ramsey, the child beauty queen. "I was in a supermarket in Austin when we were in the early stages of the group, just working out the material," he added. "And I saw one of these tabloids and it had one of those computer-enhanced photos of John Benet with a headline about what she would have looked like now. I found the whole thing quite sickening. I also kind of identified with it because of what I personally experienced back in '94 with the death of Kurt." Despite Krist's positive outlook, Eyes Adrift failed to light a spark at radio or retail. According to Billboard.com, it sold just 9,000 copies in its first year. Not long after wrapping a 3-month tour in San Antonio's White Rabbit on December 8, 2002, Eyes Adrift split up. In a post to the band's official website on August 5, 2003, Krist Novoselic wrote, "I quit. I can't deal," expressing his frustration with the music business. "Every band I've ever been in just falls apart. That hurts, but I've got a thick hide from years of conditioning." Novoselic, 38 at the time, went on to say he wasn't quitting making music altogether, but revealed he was thinking about a run for political office. "I'm relatively young," he wrote, "and I want to follow my compulsions." In between Krist Novoselic's political activities, he returned to music for a time, joining Flipper on bass in November of 2006 for touring and recording purposes. In 2008, a studio album titled Love was recorded at Novoselic's Murky Slow Studios on his farm near Deep River with singer Bruce Luce, guitarist Ted Falcone, and drummer Steve DePace. It was produced by Jack Endino. Novoselic left the band in September of 2009 to focus on his responsibilities at home. From November 2007 to September 2010, he maintained a regular column in the Seattle Weekly, where he most often wrote about music and politics. He also appeared as a newspaper vendor in the 2009 Robin Williams movie World's Greatest Dad. And on a personal note, having divorced his first wife Shelley Dilley in late 1999, he married Darbury Stenderu, an acclaimed textile artist, in early 2004.
End quote. Now, that was some of the things Krist has done post-Nirvana. But what about pre-Nirvana? As mentioned earlier, Krist was born in Compton before moving to Aberdeen, then Croatia, then back to Aberdeen. But that's just a very quick summary of Krist's early life. The following is a much more in-depth look at Krist's early story by journalist Jillian G. Gar, including how in Croatia, Krist learned to assemble a machine gun. I'm going to read this to you from Jillian G. Gar's book, Entertain Us, The Rise of Nirvana, while I show you footage I took of the famous bridge in Aberdeen and the surrounding area. Quote, Krist was born in Compton, California, and raised in Gardena, where the family grew to include another son, Robert, and a daughter, Diana.
Krist had been obsessed with music since his childhood, listening to AM radio while watching his father work on the family Volkswagen. In 1979, the Novoselics moved to Aberdeen, where Krist felt decidedly out of place. I was now in a different social scene where the kids dressed different, he later explained. There weren't a lot of kids in school that I could relate to with music. Maybe I just had a little more sophisticated understanding of music, but I wasn't very happy and my parents noticed that. And they go, oh, let's send Krist to Croatia and see if that will work for him. Krist spent a year in his parents' homeland, encountering a very different educational system than what he'd been used to at home. School was very demanding, he recalled. You had to study a lot. It seemed like the standards were a lot higher in their public education. Along with studying more orthodox subjects like history and math, there were classes like civil defense that touched on the harsh realities outside the schoolroom walls. In Krist's words, there were a couple of times when the teacher brought this huge machine gun to class and showed us how to disassemble it and put it back together. With his shortwave radio, Krist was able to gain exposure to the punk and new wave music beamed to the continent by the BBC. When he returned to Aberdeen in 1980, he began making music himself. As a child, he'd taken accordion lessons and now his mother bought him a guitar. It just seemed like I listened to so much rock and roll, I just thought I'd take it up. So I started playing guitar. Krist still felt out of place among his classmates, but kept busy in other ways, taking vocational classes in addition to his high school coursework, as well as after-school jobs. He'd also been conscientiously taping each week's broadcast of Your Mother Won't Like It, the punk new wave show that aired on Seattle station KZOK. He finally found people who shared his musical interests when a co-worker at Aberdeen's Taco Bell introduced him to Buzz and Matt from the Melvins, bringing Krist into the Melvin circle. Buzz was also impressed with Krist's taste in music. I played Krist some music, and he was one of the few people who actually got it, Buzz said. With few places available to play locally, the Melvins started landing gigs out of town, first in Olympia, the state capital, an hour's drive east from Aberdeen. But when Mike from the Melvins began spending more time with his girlfriend than the band, Buzz decided he needed to be replaced, although he avoided firing his friend by asking Matt to tell Mike the band was breaking up. He then asked Krist if he knew any drummers, and Krist introduced him to Dale Crover, who had also jammed with Krist's brother Robert. Buzz had previously seen Dale playing in local cover bands. That's really all there was, Dale explained. If you wanted to be in a band, you played with people that wanted to do high school dances. To do these shows, it was covers of the day. Dale was excited to be asked to join the Melvins because he knew the band played the occasional out-of-town show. For his part, Buzz was excited about Dale's powerful drumming. He was more into heavy metal, he said. And then we introduced him to the punk rock thing. And 1,000 things really changed for us. We've got a top-notch, #1, great, amazing drummer. And that just pushed us through to what we ended up doing, which was music that's far more complicated, way more musical.
End quote. Both Kurt and Krist had deep ties with Buzz Osborne and Dale Crover. I'm going to share with you a quote from Krist where he discusses meeting Buzz Osborne, and then I'm going to show you a clip from my interview with Dale Crover, where Dale discusses Krist and Buzz. But first, the quote from Krist Novoselic.
It's not clear what year this quote is from. Quote, I remember meeting Buzz. He played guitar and I go, yeah man, I play guitar. And he goes, well hey, let's get together. I'm really into punk rock. And he goes, have you ever heard of this band, the Dead Kennedys? Oh yeah, I've heard of them. There was stuff like Flipper and a lot of hardcore. I didn't really have a grasp on any of that stuff. I heard it and I was listening to it for a few days and I was like, wow, this stuff's really raw and wild. I was used to hearing all this really produced stuff like the Sex Pistols and Ramones. This was all just low budget, no budget stuff. And it sounded live to me. And then I borrowed the record Generic Flipper and I listened to it and it was like a revelation. It was like, wow, it was just heavy. It was art. I was affected and I've never been the same since. It was like a breakthrough.
End quote. Now, here's the Dale Crover clip. For context of what Dale is referring to, in the mid-'80s, Krist briefly relocated to Arizona before returning to Aberdeen.
Now, Krist had moved away for a while to Arizona and then came back. There's actually a letter at the museum in Seattle. Do you know about the Mopop Museum?
I've been there, yes.
There's a letter in there that Buzz had sent to Krist when he was living in Arizona, talking about Kurt and that demo that I did with him at his aunt's house, and saying how he's got some pretty good songs. So when Krist came back from Arizona, that's when those two hooked up and kind of started playing together and looking for a drummer. They found Aaron Burkhart, who was another local guy, and they were playing with him for a while. And then that's before I did that original demo with them. So
yeah, so cool.
After him, yeah. And you know the rest of the history.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So what did you think of the songs on the demo that you played, the Illiteracy Will Prevail? Did you like the songs?
Oh yeah, I thought Kurt had great songs.
That's cool. Did you have anyone in particular? Like Spank Through is the one that everyone knows from that demo. Is there one that you?
Yeah, I mean, right. I mean, Nirvana is mostly Kurt. I mean, those songs. As you know, some of those songs ended up being Nirvana songs. Some of them I think kind of had more of a Butthole Surfers influence to them. Like
Anorexicist.
Might have been. There's one, and why I say Butthole Surfers is because he accidentally recorded over a section of the song, and he's like, fuck! Forgot to like flip the channels back to safety, and so accidentally recorded over this section of the song, and so he's like, ah! And so, I know, and he just like plugged in the guitar direct and just did this crazy, all of a sudden it cuts to this crazy Paul Leary style solo. And then kind of comes back into the song, like covering up the fact that he recorded over, and it worked,
Funny. And this was all at Aunt Mary's house?
Yep.
So about a year prior to the release of Nevermind, you played drums with Nirvana during their 1990 Sonic Youth tour, that tour being a big turning point in the band's history. At that point in time when things were really getting off the ground, were Kurt and Krist feeling any pressure mounting on them?
Those guys were keeping their heads about it. I mean, they're already having some success. And even when I was with them, we were here in LA and we were having meetings with A&R people and managers and stuff like that. Most of them at the time, they didn't really, they could tell, they just kind of seemed like phony Hollywood types, And I think, just even touring with Sonic Youth, I think that was an influence on them because they ended up signing with the same label and having the same manager and all that kind of stuff. So, but yeah, I mean, they knew that they were going to get signed somehow or something that was going to happen. And yeah, I mean, even Sonic Youth were doing really well. That tour that we did was for the Goo record, and they were kind of, I mean, for their band, like that was great. They were like selling punk rock gold, So I remember thinking and talking with those guys thinking like, you guys could probably do that and maybe even do a little bit better. Nobody thought nobody thought it'd be like that,
Around this time, during the Sonic Youth tour in late 1990, Nirvana was being heavily courted by the major labels. Eventually, Nirvana left their independent record label Sub Pop and switched over to the major DGC. I'm going to share with you a quote from Krist explaining why they left Sub Pop, and then I'm going to show you a clip from my interview with Sub Pop co-founder Bruce Pavitt, where he discusses how thanks to Krist Novoselic, Nirvana leaving Sub Pop actually saved the record label. It's a really cool story, stick around for that. But first, the Krist quote.
When we were on Sub Pop, we got used to the lack of options on an independent label. All these challenges, the lack of cash, being independent and small, can strangle your infrastructure, you know what I mean? There was no future, so we looked for a major label because we were fed up with the poor distribution of our albums. We wanted stability. The whole world around us told us what we were going to do was dumb, but now we have absolute control over what we do. Large companies are now getting out their checkbooks to catch the independent bands. It's inevitable. Certain things contribute to other things happening. They've reflected on the state of music, and they've made a great discovery. At last, they're aware of what's been cooking for years on independent labels. Now, they want to bring that music to the surface. As a result, the independent or alternative label is meaningless. It's too early to judge, though, what's going on with all these changes. You need some perspective to know if this will help change something, some value, or some market rule. What I do know is that all these bands are different to the conventional pop products. They've got nothing to do with the prototype of album-oriented rock or with all those heavy metal bands. People want genuine rock and roll, which reinvents itself all the time. It's natural with any art form. It's the fate of the planet. The forces that make the continents drift, day becoming night, everything's got to change. It comes down to how the record executives begin to change their methods, their way of seeing things. They wonder, what the heck are all these new bands? What the heck is happening?
I have a copy of Nevermind, and on the back of the CD, there's the DGC logo, and right beside it, there's the Sub Pop logo, even though Sub Pop wasn't involved in the release of Nevermind. So how come the Sub Pop logo is on Nevermind? And also, what was the, legal process like getting Nirvana off of Sub Pop and onto DGC?
Well, what happened was, I'll give you the story. Nirvana signed to a 3-record deal, and that's
with you guys or with them?
With us. And that's okay. I'm going to tell you a story here. This is some stuff. At that time in the 80s, typically indie labels didn't work with contracts. They didn't have money for attorneys, right? So it was always a handshake deal. Hey, we'll split the profit. That was just the way indie labels did business. It's a handshake deal. But in 89, the summer of 89, a few months after Bleach had been out, Krist Novoselic came to my house and in a fairly aggressive way insisted that we sign them to an actual contract. Okay, which totally saved our ass in the end, right? So we had no money for an attorney, so I called Poneman. He went to the library, he Xeroxed or photocopied a boilerplate contract, filled in Nirvana, cost us 10 cents, right? They come in, they sign it, and because we had that contract, when Nirvana decided to jump to a major label using the recording of their second album that we thought we were going to release with Butch Vig. Again, we sent them to Butch Vig in Madison. They recorded the album. They came back, but what we didn't know is that they were sending that out as a demo to major labels. This is how it goes. So DGC stepped in and said, we're taking these guys. You're just going to have to deal with it, but we'll negotiate, a settlement. So it was kind of a bittersweet moment. They left the label. We were a little heartbroken, but that's life in the biz. But because they were signed to 2 more records, we were able to fine-tune the negotiation and get that logo on Nevermind, which is definitely a source of pride. We got royalties from In Utero and Nevermind, so that really helped us out tremendously. But it never would have happened if Krist Novoselic hadn't come to my house and demanded a contract. So life's funny that way. Sub Pop would have gone out of business 30 years ago if Novoselic hadn't asked for that contract. So sometimes these little things can turn your whole life around.
You mentioned now that you got royalties from In Utero as well. What is your connection to In Utero?
Well, we just had royalties on because we had them signed to a 3-record contract. They had put out Bleach, so that we got royalties on their next 2 records. Incesticide was a co-production between us and DGC, so that was a separate project. So we got royalties from that as well. And Bleach, of course, has sold like 2 million copies by this point. Think about this: a $600 recording selling 2 million records. That's pretty unusual.
Yeah.
And so Nirvana, when they went to the majors, they were able to draw on some of the best talents of the indie scene, like the producer Butch Vig, the producer Steve Albini. These were 2 of the best producers in the indie scene. And so what was very cool about Nirvana is they really empowered and gave work to people in that network. And I have a lot of respect for them for doing that. The mainstream, the mainstream came to Nirvana. Nirvana didn't go to the mainstream, and that's what was so amazing about the band.
Hey guys, I'm going to show you now a few clips regarding Krist Novoselic from interviews I've done over the years. These are with Nirvana producer Steve Albini, Nirvana photographer Charles Peterson, Nirvana guitar tech Ernie Bailey, and Nirvana producer Jack Endino. Then, I'm going to share with you a sarcastic comment from Kurt and Krist where they claim they started Nirvana in a McDonald's. By the way, a long time ago, I was actually in a McDonald's commercial. If you want to see that commercial, stick around to the end.
Is it true that they set their pants on fire when you guys finished the record?
There's a cleaning solvent that you use to clean the tape heads on the tape machines, which is very flammable. And you can also splash that solvent on something else and set it on fire. And so we were setting a lot of stuff on fire during the session, just, jackass entertainment sort of stuff. There's a photo somewhere, I can't remember who took it, but there was an Instamatic or a Polaroid photo of Dave Grohl's ass on fire, and I think it's Krist Novoselic is lighting a cigar off of the fire that's on Dave Grohl's ass.
I mean, yeah, Krist was, Krist definitely liked pranks and was just, first time I met Krist Novoselic, was out at Bob Whitaker Mudhoney's tour manager's cabin out on the Washington coast. And we were all down on the beach at night having a fire, and all of a sudden this big tall guy shows up with like no clothes on, runs down, jumps through the fire, and runs off screaming down the beach. And I'm like, what the hell? And Bob's like, it's Krist Novoselic. He's the bass player in Nirvana. Well, I'm like, okay.
Do you have any funny memories of Krist Novoselic in particular? Because he was a prankster too, right?
Yeah, and he and I were very close during that time and neighbors, and there are so many stories. You know, we did so much crazy stuff together, and it was hilarious. One of my favorite, I think one of the funniest moments with him was, I remember going over to his house and we were hanging out, and I think that it was like a last minute thing he said to me that I think it was the Melvins were playing down at this club called Rock Candy in Seattle. And he asked if I wanted to go down there, and I said, yeah, sure, let's go down there. Let's just go surprise them. We won't even, call or try to get on the list or whatever. So we were standing out in line waiting for the doors to open, waiting in line for the Melvins. And so at one point, I think they were kind of late opening the doors. And there's a lot of people in the line who are looking at this, this guy, he's really tall, and it's obviously Krist from Nirvana. And at one point, Krist gets kind of impatient, and I think he said something like, come on, open the doors. He said, don't you guys know who I am? And we're like, there's this moment of silence. It was like, oh no. And he goes, I played Latka in the hit TV series Taxi. And so with that, it was like, it was just incredible because he looks so much like him, and it's just his sense of humor is so off the charts.
When it comes to Nirvana, obviously with two superstars like Kurt and Dave, sometimes Krist gets looked over, but he was super important to that band. Working with Krist, how was he like in the studio?
Great. One take.
Really?
Yeah. He's very good. He's very natural. He knows the parts. He just does it. I mean, Krist is quick. He gets what he's doing. I mean, he's got a natural feel for melodic bass lines. Accurate player, very tight, does what he wants to do. And in later years, he got really good at playing accordion, which is not easy.
Yeah.
He's put a lot of time into learning the accordion, actually, which in his own band, Giants in the Trees, that I worked on their first album, recorded much of it and mixed it and mastered it, and then I ended up mastering their second record, too. He plays bass and accordion on those records. He's very good. And sometimes he writes big riffs on the bass. I also did 2 records for Flipper when he was in that band, which was another story entirely. Flipper were an interesting bunch of guys, shall we say.
That's cool.
When my band Skin Yard was doing our last tour, which was a tour of Europe in October, November of 1991, toward the end of our tour, we had a show. Somehow our booking agents got together and we got added to a bill with Nirvana at a club called the Arena. It wasn't an arena, it was a club. It just was called the Arena in Vienna, Austria. And it was Nirvana and Urge Overkill, and Skin Yard got added as the opening act. And interestingly enough, we hadn't seen them in months, and this was after, it was a club show, but it was packed and fully sold out because Nevermind had just been out for like a month or two, and everyone in Europe knew about it. Mm-hmm. The band was blowing up like right then. But they had to finish this club tour they were doing. And our equipment had been stolen in Rome a couple of weeks, maybe a week or so before that. Our guitars were stolen out of our van, so we had finished literally the last 4 or 5 shows of our tour. We had to use borrowed guitars from whatever opening band played with us because we were doing our own headline tour. But this one show, we got added to the Nirvana bill, and we had no bass and no guitar. And so we had to basically say, hey, can we borrow? And Nirvana was going to let us use their equipment, but Kurt's guitars were all left-handed. Oh. And he was ready to give me a guitar. He was going to give me one of his, Jag Stangs or whatever the heck he was playing, but it was a lefty. And he said, well, I can have my tech flip the the bridge around for you, but I mean, we were sound checking right then. I was like, come on, so, and Krist offered to let our bass player, Pat, use one of his basses, but Krist, being somewhat tall, needed 2 guitar straps duct taped together end to end, because he likes to play the bass low, plus he's really tall. So his bass had 2 guitar straps end to end, also duct taped to the bass itself, so the strap wouldn't come off. So I remember he put it on our bass player, who is tall but not excessively tall, and the bass hung, somewhere below his knees. And we all had a good laugh about it, actually, and then we went to Urge Overkill and begged them very nicely if we could borrow their instruments, for our show. And they were a little, I suspect they had heard a little bit about Nirvana smashing equipment, and they kind of thought, oh, here's another Seattle band. And they were very like, now you're not going to damage these instruments, are you? They were very like, do not smash our guitars. And we're just like, no, that's not our thing. We're very respectful. I've been playing the same guitar for 5 years. I had to, because, the guy in Urge Overkill, he had a nice Gretsch guitar that he let me play for our show. And, I just had to sort of ease his fears that we were not another Seattle instrument smashing outfit. So, Urge Overkill very kindly let us use their guitar and bass. And we had one more show with Urge Overkill, I think the next night in another part of Austria. And they let us use their instruments. But that was funny, actually. I mean, the Nirvana people were ready to help out, but it wasn't going to work.
Hey guys, this might sound kind of ridiculous, but according to a quote from Krist Novoselic I came across recently, apparently Krist and Kurt decided to start a band after working at McDonald's in Aberdeen. Now, the reason I say this might sound kind of ridiculous is because this is a story that, to the best of my knowledge, has never been discussed in any of the official Nirvana biographies or any of the other interviews from the band before. But nevertheless, the following is a brief excerpt from a radio interview Krist Novoselic and Kurt Cobain did with a radio station in Wisconsin that aired on April 9th, 1990. Nirvana were in Wisconsin in early April of 1990 to record songs for what was supposed to be their second album with Sub Pop. The band ultimately left their label Sub Pop later in 1990, and in 1991, the major label DGC released their second album, Nevermind. In any case, here's what Kurt and Krist had to say during this radio interview about McDonald's of all things. I believe the period they're referring to is the mid-80s in Aberdeen, Washington. Quote, Krist, Kurt and I had a job tree planting. Kurt, we were hired by McDonald's to plant trees. Krist, because they feel guilty because cows exhale like methane or something. So we were digging through the dumpster, trying to find the bag where they throw the good food away, because they only let it be in there for like 10 minutes and they just throw it out. And we had massive Big Macs, McDLTs, everything, We were feasting. So we said, hey, let's start a band. End quote. Now, this is a bit off topic, but I actually acted in a McDonald's commercial about 10 years ago. Here it is.
I'll have a large mocha with whipped cream, and what do you think is the biggest moment on Hockey Night in Canada?
Well, Gretzky's return to Edmonton in '88 was a huge Hockey Night moment.
But you're forgetting Lafleur's return to Montreal in '89.
No, he had it right. It's Gretzky's return to Edmonton.
No, you're forgetting Lafleur in '89.
I keep telling you, Gretzky back to Edmonton.
Get a load of these guys. They think they're experts.
It happened on Hockey Night in Canada.
So that does it for Kurt Cobain and Krist Novoselic. I do want to share with you one more quote, though, from another close friend of Kurt's. This is from Mark Lanigan, lead singer of the Screaming Trees and a very, very close friend of Kurt Cobain's. In an interview for Rolling Stone, journalist Corey Groh asked Mark Lanigan the following question. Quote, you wrote that you have a deep regret for your actions around his death, because he'd called you that day and you didn't return his calls. How did you process his death? The following is Mark Lanigan's response. This article for Rolling Stone was published on April 23rd, 2020. Quote, when a drug addict loses a friend, they just do more drugs. I moved forward by sticking with the people that I knew, Dylan Carlson and my best friend in Seattle, Lane Staley, and we continued to do what we always did. But now we were missing a huge piece of our lives.
Logic would tell you that when a friend of yours dies the way that Cobain did, it would make you wise up and say, oh crap, man, do I want to end up like this too? But instead, what a drug addict does is they just do more drugs and cry in their beer. Kurt's death just made me go deeper and deeper, just wanting to disappear and forget that I had what started as this really pure relationship of mutual admiration with Kurt for each other's music, which we had for years. We liked the same kind of music, and then that warped into a situation where he had become so famous that he said to me at one point, "You and Dylan are the only real friends I have anymore," at the height of his popularity, and it was really just sad. I also remember thinking, what kind of friend am I? Because this guy used to look up to me, and he always acted as though he did look up to me still, even though I knew he saw my decline. I just remember thinking, wow, I could have shown some decent guidance here to help this kid who looked up to me and who I loved. And instead, I was just a guy who became one of those people that would go out and buy drugs for his more famous friends who couldn't go out in public. That was hard to reconcile, and it always will be. I could have been a different person, but I wasn't. Kurt and I were really close before he became famous. Funny enough, I was actually the famous one in our relationship for a number of years. He had a natural talent. I knew that from the moment I saw him singing in the Ellensburg Public Library, in a tiny town I grew up in. Dylan Carlson had asked me to go see his friend Kurt's band play there because Kurt was a fan of mine. And that's how I met Kurt, as a fan of mine. He looked up to me sort of like a big brother, but I knew this guy had something magical. It took a while, but obviously, the world recognized his talent at some point, and we all know what happened with that. End quote. Mark Lanegan and Nirvana have shared history with one another, particularly the Jury Project in 1989, where Mark Lanegan and Mark Pickerel of the Screaming Trees recorded 4 songs together with Kurt and Krist, most notably a rendition of Where Did You Sleep Last Night, which was released on Mark Lanegan's debut solo record in 1990, The Winding Sheet. The jury sessions took place in August of 1989. A few months earlier, on April 14th, 89, Nirvana played a show in Mark Lanegan's hometown of Ellensburg, Washington, a small city about 2 hours southeast of Seattle. The show made a big impression on Mark Lanegan, who once recalled the following, quote, "In the spring of 89, Nirvana played a show at the community center in my hometown of Ellensburg, Washington. They completely blew me away. It was like seeing The Who in their prime. After 2 songs, some guy who worked there stopped the show. Nirvana had gone over their time limit because the local bands who had opened had gone over time. So they just stood there for a second, and then Chris started throwing his bass in the air, up to the top of this 20-foot ceiling and catching it with one hand. Meanwhile, Kurt was letting his amp go as loud as heck, and their road manager got into a fist fight with the guy who stopped the show. The whole thing was completely crazed, and this was in Ellensburg of all places. I still believe to this day, Nirvana's the best band I've ever seen." End quote. Mark Lanegan and Kurt Cobain are of course 2 of the marquee figures of the grunge scene, and according to Mark Pickerel, the 2 of them had a mutual respect for one another. The following is a quote from Mark Pickerel, quote, "I know that Kurt was a big fan of Lanegan's. They traded a lot of tapes and had conversations about different artists they liked. Apparently, I don't know if Mark turned Kurt onto Leadbelly or if Kurt was already a fan, but at some point, Mark approached me about playing drums on a project that he and Kurt wanted to start, which would really focus on blues, particularly Leadbelly's catalog. I believe we were also talking about playing songs by all the great bluesmen. I got really excited about it and was envisioning this supergroup that was bound for success, sort of to be the modern-day Northwest version of Cream. It was funny because, having been in a band with Mark for so long, his personality in the Screaming Trees was he couldn't help but be really the band leader. He is just a natural leader, is very outspoken, and can be very aggressive. The couple of rehearsals we had, I saw a different side of Mark, one that was much quieter. He seemed to have a great deal of respect for Kurt and Krist. At the same time, Kurt seemed intimidated by Lanegan's talents and vision." End quote. As mentioned earlier in the first Mark Lanegan quote that I read, according to Mark Lanegan himself, Mark's best friend was Lane Staley of Alice in Chains. The following is a quote where Mark Lanegan talks about the death of Lane Staley and how he compares Lane Staley and Kurt Cobain to one another, how their 2 deaths affected him differently. Quote, "Out of my friends, I was the guy who they always thought would never have a chance of getting clean because I was so maniacal in my approach. I would have climbed Mount Everest for drugs. I was always trying to kick. Lane Staley was a magical person who was also hell-bent on doing drugs until he died. The first time I saw him after I'd gotten clean, I'd been clean a year. I'm pretty sure that Jerry Cantrell and Mike Inez flew me up to Seattle because they were unable to get into his house. He had a camera and lived in the penthouse of this condo. So whenever anybody from that camp would come to see him, he would just ignore it. Jerry and Mike knew that when he saw me, he would let me in. I went along with that. And I also wanted him to see that I was clean, that it was possible to get clean, that his prediction that I would never be able to do it had failed. Hopefully, maybe it would give him the idea that he himself could do it too. But he didn't want to do it. When I got there, I said, "Hey man, it's been a while. I've been clean for more than 12 months. And he was like, "No, you weren't, man. You just left like 2 months ago." His sense of time had warped, and he wasn't buying the truth from me. I remember him saying at that point, "I always just keep thinking I'm gonna get that same feeling I got the first time again." And dude, I never got that first feeling again after the first time I ever did dope. I immediately had to do 5 times more to even get close to it. So for me, that was an impossibility, but that was his obsession. It's heartbreaking the way he went. I always knew that that's what was going to happen, although I had always hoped that there would be some medical emergency that would put him in the hospital and give him a moment away from the routine of crack and heroin that might give him a break and some insight. That medical emergency ended up being his death. I still love listening to Alice in Chains. When they come on the radio, it makes me feel good. But if Nirvana comes on the radio, it throws me into a depression. Like, if I'm in an Uber, you have to turn that off. And I think it's because of my own actions in the deaths of both these guys who I loved equally. Of course, I was not a great influence on Lane, but drugs were a mutual thing. I put it like this. Kurt was like a little brother. Lane was like a twin.
Hey guys, now we're at the part of the video where I'll be focusing specifically on Chad Channing. The following is a quote from Chad where he reflects on his time with Nirvana.
One of the memories that stick out to me from my time with Nirvana is that I like the fact when we were starting out, we drove this small snub-nosed Dodge van, and it was just the 3 of us, myself, Kurt, and Krist. Sometimes we'd have a sound guy with us, but mostly it was just us 3, or sometimes we'd travel with Jason Everman for a while who played with us. In any case, it was kind of a challenge, but I enjoyed it. Like, when we first started out, we'd play a show and we'd be wondering if we'd make enough money for gas to get to the next show. So it was very touch and go at first. One time, and this is kind of a funny one for me, we were driving through Montana, which it takes a long time to drive through that state. I was driving and I was kind of bored, so I decided to drive with my teeth. So I have my teeth on the steering wheel and I'm just driving like that. I've been doing that for a long time, and then Krist woke up and looked at me like, "What are you doing? Don't drive with your teeth." I said, okay, but I didn't have the heart to tell him that I've been doing that for almost 2 hours. It was a good feeling to do our own thing. We didn't really have anybody else but ourselves. There wasn't like a tour manager with us or anything, so we were kind of just on the road, following our noses as we go. I don't know, something about just seeing places and going different places to play. I've always just loved that. It was a lot of fun doing that with those guys. As far as any low point goes, we had this show in New York. They had a rubber mat in this club instead of a carpet for the drums. And so during the show, the kick drum kept sliding and sliding and sliding. And I was constantly during the songs just trying to grab it and pull it forward, grab it and pull it forward. And eventually by the last song, Negative Creep, like halfway through it, I got so frustrated that I stopped. I picked up the kick drum over my head and just slammed it on the stage, which I ended up cracking it, so I had to duct tape it and tape it together because it was only halfway through the tour, so the rest of it we had to do it with a cracked drum set. But yeah, that was a low. I did not like that moment. In terms of things ending with the band, I have no regrets because I've always sort of thought of it that things just sort of fall in place for a reason. For example, maybe I was the perfect puzzle piece for the band at that time, and then they needed another piece to do other things. Our differences are mostly strictly on a musical level. I mean, we always stayed friends. In fact, I remember one of the first times I saw them with Dave at this place called the OK Hotel in Seattle. It was the first time I'd seen the guys in probably a year or so, and it was really good to see them. We were saying, "Hey, how's it going?" So it was really friendly. And I met Dave for the first time too and found out what a really nice guy Dave is. So it was really nice meeting him too. I hold no regrets, certainly have no ill will. It's just part of the business sometimes, you know? I have no regrets, and I look back at those days and think, wow, I played a small part in something that had a big impact. I'm happy with that. I think that's kind of neat. Now, in terms of when I first met the guys, I first met Kurt and Krist at a Malfunction show. They were playing the Community World Theater in Tacoma. I went there, and a friend of mine, Damon, introduced me to Kurt and Krist because they were looking for a drummer. Before that, I was in a band called Tick Dolly Row, which had actually featured Ben Shepherd, who, of course, would become part of Soundgarden. In fact, that's how Kurt and Krist heard about me. A friend of mine, John Goodmanson, had this radio show at the college station, and Tick Dolly Row went up there. As I would learn later, Kurt and Krist were listening to that show and thought, wow, that's some pretty cool stuff. The thing that lured me into their band was how simple the music was, yet with the vocal melodies was just really cool. He did a really good job of taking something simple and making it sound really, really good. I remember seeing this show when they were named Bliss. You got this one guy who's really, really tall, just hammering the bass. And then there's Kurt. He had some kind of, it looked like crushed velvet, silk, purple or blue, bell-bottom pants. And I think he was wearing platform shoes. He was a really colorful character up there. He's louder than hell, screaming, and then there's Krist, who's standing the size of the Eiffel Tower on one end. Krist was the talkative one. Kurt seemed on the quiet side, almost timid. Kurt and Krist always had a pretty good relationship. It was like a special little brotherhood sort of thing. Kurt was a quiet character a lot of the time, so if something was bothering him, you'd never know it. And if he talked to anybody about it, it would always be with Krist. Those guys really cared for each other quite a bit. Now, in terms of the band itself, the first time we toured, Bleach hadn't come out yet. We just had the single out, Love Buzz Big Cheese. That was an interesting tour. It was hit or miss. We could end up playing Tucson for 20 people and be lucky to come out of there with $30 to get us enough gas to make it to the next town, where maybe the next town would be a different story. There were these people that would come out. We're on the Sub Pop Singles Club and we know all about you guys. It's like, you do? Now, recording Bleach happened fast. We were in there for I think a week, recording at Reciprocal, a really cool scene. I always remember Jack and Dino sitting there and he had a circle of snacks around him, chocolate bars. We did a lot of weird experimenting with snare sounds. We actually took 2 snare drums, took the bottom head off of one of them, and the top head off another, combined the 2 drums together. So there ended up being this gap between the 2 snares, but I used double-sided screws to link them together. Another thing, Blue was a song that initially was played in D. So when we went to record that song, it had turned out that we were already in D and that everyone turned down, or at least Krist did, to C. It was even lower. When Bleach came out and the second tour began, things were definitely a lot different. It was generally packed houses. We spent a lot of time hanging out with people that would come to the show and almost always get hooked up with a place to stay. Some of the most fun places to play were in the Midwest. I think it's just because they didn't get a whole lot of bands coming through there, except for really big major acts at whatever Coliseum. One of the bigger memories was when we played in Dallas, and we got caught in that massive rainstorm. It's on the DVD with the lights out. We ended up staying at somebody's house, but it seemed like there were 10 or 11 people living at this big house. And then we had that show in San Antonio where we didn't end up staying at anybody's place. We ended up camping out. When we were out there, some sort of campground, we woke up and heard these ducks that sounded like they were getting ripped apart. Crazy noise, huge splashing in the water. I think Jason Everman was walking down at night with a flashlight looking around the water trying to see what the heck was going on. We're like, could that have been an alligator? Hell, it's swampland. I wouldn't put it past it. Kurt or Krist might have decided to sleep inside the van after that. Milwaukee is where I think some of the footage on the DVD came from. The Pixel Vision stuff, the really weird black and white grainy small screen stuff. That clip is a time when we were driving down the road at night. We put up a blanket to separate the 2 front seats. Chris was driving, and me and Kurt had the Pixel Visions going. Just started doing random things and saying random stuff. I think we were drinking Jim Beam, wine and whiskey. On tour, we listened to a lot of artists, including Shonen Knife. Those guys hadn't been familiar with Shonen Knife until I brought in a tape. In Boston, I picked up The Man Who Sold the World. I know those guys, Kurt anyway, weren't big David Bowie fans. But I popped it in one time, and Kurt was like, wow, this is really cool. This is David Bowie? I'm pretty sure that's where he got the idea of doing The Man Who Sold the World. Touring definitely had its ups and downs. I think Kurt having that onstage freakout was in Italy. I guess he was questioning the whole band thing and everything else. My perspective on it is kind of a lot different because pretty much after I was born, I've spent most of my time moving. I've moved so many times it's ridiculous, so I'm very accustomed to being on the road. When I'm touring, I'm completely comfortable and happy when I'm out of my element. I may have been the only one on that entire tour that enjoyed myself all the time. I know it was tough. The other guys would complain of being sick of eating bread and bologna spread. Including Tad, who came with us to Europe, there were 9 of us in this passenger van, so we were all in pretty close quarters. When Jason Everman joined the band, the idea that Kurt was thinking was, I'd like to get somebody in there so I don't always have to worry about trying to keep that rhythm up, or if I mess up, there's someone to back me up. So I've got that freedom to concentrate on what I'm singing. We had the one tour with him, and to this day, nobody's really sure, except for Jason himself, what went on. Halfway through the tour, when we got to New York, he got really quiet on us. We tried asking him what was up and never got much response. We had a lot of fun with him until whatever happened changed. Then it got kinda weird. In April of 1990, Kurt, Krist, and myself recorded several songs with Butch Vig in Madison, Wisconsin. Half the songs that came out on 1991's Nevermind were songs we recorded with Butch Vig the previous year. Those April of 1990 recordings with Butch Vig were to be the next album for Sub Pop. But we didn't know at the time, at least I didn't know, that Sub Pop was talking to Geffen. A deal was made that this wouldn't be quite a Sub Pop release and Geffen would take over and put out the album. They ended up doing that, but re-recorded the album. By the time Nirvana re-recorded the album in May and June of 91, I was no longer in the band. Everybody's heard things like, he left or he was fired. It was actually a combination of both. I was hoping to get the opportunity to chip in with some songwriting. After Bleach, Kurt talked about it. He wouldn't mind having some help with writing. And of course, being a songwriter, I was like, I'm all for that. But over time I realized that wasn't going to happen. What slowly happened was I just started losing my inspiration to play. It shows. Ultimately, I didn't give them much choice but to kick me out of the band. You know, when you don't feel like you're being all you can be in a band, it eventually kind of wears you down. And that's what it was ultimately doing to me. It was just kind of dragging me down, and it was like I started feeling like a drum machine more than anything else. Somewhere along the line, I just started losing some of my inspiration. And of course, when you do that, it's going to show. No matter what you're doing, even in the workplace. If someone's not in it, you can tell. And so what do? Well, you got to get rid of them. And so Krist and Kurt made the long drive up and came to my place to let me know. It was a weird drive for them. I remember talking about it with Krist years down the road. It was like, yeah, that was a real horrible drive. Me and Kurt were not looking forward to that at all. Because the thing was that we were always good friends, so when I say that it was due to musical differences, that's exactly what it was. That was the deal. Part of me thinks, maybe at some point I should have voiced my opinion about what I wanted to do and seen where that would have taken me. But I don't know, for whatever reason, I didn't do that. In any case, the conversation that day with Kurt and Krist when they came to my place was kind of brief, actually. They kind of opened up and basically said that it doesn't seem like lately I've been giving it my all. And I actually agreed because I wasn't. I was kind of burning out on it. It was like, yeah, that's true. I told them that I completely understand your guys' decision on this. I think part of it too was the fact that when we were recording in Madison, Wisconsin with Butch Vig in April of 1990 for what was supposed to be the second Sub Pop record, those were the same times that Sub Pop had been talking to Geffen. And so when we found that out too, that was a big stepping stone. So I think on both sides of the water, Kurt and Krist were like, wow, we got to figure out what to do here because we were about to jump up to hopefully a bigger level. And for me, it was almost crunch time for myself. It was like, well, I got to figure this out. How should I tell them that maybe I shouldn't play with you guys anymore? I don't know. It was weird. I mean, part of me totally wanted to go on because it's music. I liked it. It's one of those things where I always enjoyed listening to the guys playing even while I was playing because I love good vocal melody line stuff. And that's what I thought was so great about Kurt, which was one of the big reasons why I joined the band. Because I like that whole mix of melody and guitar he was doing. So I really did like the music we were doing. Part of me did want to continue on, but the realistic side was, I don't know how happy I would be. It's like, sure, I probably would have had a few more dollars in the billfold, but would I be doing my own thing? Would I be doing, music that's more with me involved in it? Probably not. Even though Kurt mentioned that he was looking to do that at one point, realizing that wasn't going to happen, I was pretty certain that wasn't going to happen at all, ever. I actually didn't even talk about that though with Kurt that day at my place. Part of me was like, let's just get this over with. I kind of let them do most of the talking about the stuff and what was going on, just listening to how they were feeling about it. And I was like, that makes sense. At the same time, I'm not really sure why I just didn't tell my side of the story, so to speak. I never really did. I think it's because maybe part of me was thinking, well, if I did, I don't want to make this more of a hassle or a big deal any more than it has to be. In any case, when it came to the band's first album without me, Nevermind, overall, all the parts on the re-recorded songs were the same. In fact, when I heard that, I was like, wow. I was flattered that they kept my stuff, the things that I had done. Kinda the greatest compliment I've ever received. For instance, in Bloom, I had the single kick drum thing going on for main verses, and then Dave added an extra one. But the majority of that stuff is all pretty much the same. In 1992, when Incesticide was being put together, I was never actually contacted by Krist or Krist during that time, just by Nirvana's lawyer. I had heard I was going to have 3 tracks on the album: Dive, Stain, and Big Long Now. A lot of that stuff I had heard before because it was from the demo they had made with Dale. The demo they gave to me just before I joined up. I'd never heard the cover tunes before, so that was pretty cool. I was surprised to see Big Long Now in the list. That was a song that I had thought might never get released. That was a song I actually named, like About a Girl. And Stain was taken from the recordings at Soundhouse with Steve Fisk. There were a number of cool songs from that session which ended up on the Lights Out stuff, like Token Eastern Song. Kurt was a really interesting guy. Sometimes he just beat the heck out of himself, out of his chest, like he was trying to dislodge phlegm. Every now and then, he'd talk about it. He'd be like, I don't know what it is, it's just sometimes it feels like it's overcongested. Kurt definitely kept to himself a lot. He was more open with Krist about things, but once in a while I'd be surprised. We'd talk about things that were more of an intimate kind of subject. I always liked Kurt. I wish I had at least one more opportunity to talk to him. Never had that opportunity. I think Nirvana's music stands up pretty well. It definitely shows a testament to how rapidly a change in music can happen. One kind of music is really popular and then bam, some band comes around and it's completely changed music. It wouldn't surprise me if Nirvana albums were being bought for years to come. I look at some of the greatest bands around. The Rolling Stones, the Beatles, Led Zeppelin, they're bands that will always sell. To me, it's hard to imagine a day where nobody will ever buy another Stones album. I think it's possible that Nirvana may end up in a similar thing, where people will always be buying Nirvana records for as long as music is music. I was always a fan of Swap Meet. It's probably my favorite song from Bleach. I also like playing Sifting. Those were probably a couple of my favorites off the record. When we were making that album, I don't think any of us thought we were making something special at that time. We didn't have the objective to get huge or anything. We were just playing music because we wanted to do it. We just wanted to do our kind of music. When we recorded the record, we had no expectations of how many copies it would even sell. So we didn't have a lot of high expectations for ourselves. We were just glad that we were doing exactly what we want to do, because it was always like, well, it seems like record companies or whatever get a tight hold on bands and stuff. You worry about losing your inner artistry, I suppose. I think we got pretty lucky to make Bleach for only $600. I know that the very next time I made a record, it cost a lot more than that, so it's kind of a rare thing. I think it's just one of those things that you never really know when you go into the studio and record. I guess it was just the magic was there that week. It only took us just a little over a week to record the record. I look back on it now and think, wow, how did we ever do that? I've had people come up to me and tell me about how their father, for instance, was a really huge fan and he probably turned them onto Bleach. And it's great because I would never have guessed 30 years ago that Nirvana would still be relevant. And so when that happens and people come up and say, this album changed my dad's life and it's a great record, it's kind of a wow sort of feeling. Music is always about connecting and reaching out to people and sharing. And so the important thing to me is that Nirvana did that. It's great to know that Nirvana had such an effect that so many people enjoyed listening to the band and still do to this day. I really love that. It's taught me that you never really know what can happen in your life. If you work hard at something and persevere, you never know what's going to happen. Nirvana's continued success has shown me that music is everlasting and will just continue to go long after I leave this earth. And maybe one day there can be another band that comes around and changes the whole scene of music again. Never say never. Again, when it comes to early Nirvana, when we first started touring, our goal was to be able to make enough money to get enough gas to get to the next venue to play. But it was surprising. I remember thinking, These people were showing up and were like, hey man, that single's really awesome and all this stuff. The Love Buzz Big Cheese single. I remember even hanging out inside the clubs before they were opened. People would be going by and be like, hey, is Nirvana playing tonight? And I'd be like, maybe on the other side of the door or something. And I'd be like, wow, that's really weird. It's like we're here somewhere in the Midwest and somebody actually knows who we are. That's really strange. That's pretty much what the single and the tour was like. But when Bleach came out, it was a totally different story. It was like everywhere we played, people knew who we were. And all the venues we played were just packed with people. And it was kind of a rush. It was like, wow, this is so wild. I mean, before we had some packed shows, we had a lot of shows that didn't have a lot of people as well. But this time around was totally different. The Bleach record was totally different. The shows were a blast. The shows were a lot of fun. It's something I'll always hold on to as some of the best times of my life. In terms of Kurt's death, I think the thing to me was, I think it was just kind of like, almost like being robbed. There were just certain things that I kind of wanted to say, things that I would have liked to have talked with him about. Not necessarily anything specific, just that we hadn't talked in a while, and I realized that was gone. That was the hardest part for me, that it was just gone. The opportunity wasn't even going to happen anymore. There was just something that I just sort of felt being in the band. I knew Kurt had something that was really unique and cool that was going to come out eventually at some point. I think the big question was when. It took me a long time after Nevermind came out where it sunk in that, gosh, this band is actually getting pretty big. I became a really big Nirvana fan when I first heard the recordings of Nevermind. I was really excited for those guys. It was really, really cool. Looking back on the April 1990 sessions with Butch Vig, the sessions which were the precursors to Nevermind, everybody appeared to be pretty comfortable working with Butch Vig. Every time we'd go into the studio, Kurt and Krist always had a certain agenda or something in mind. I was never really one to be upfront with putting out ideas and stuff like that. I was always a little bit more in the background. I think they were happy with the end result recordings. I think we all were. As I recall, when they were working on Nevermind in 1991, Kurt originally wanted to keep the songs they had already recorded in Madison to put on the record. But Geffen Records apparently wanted to redo the whole thing. I guess what they were looking for, being a major label, was something as polished as they could get from the band. So in order to do that, consistency in sound and recording is probably everything. They probably felt it would sound too inconsistent sound-wise, like, oh, you can definitely tell us from a different recording. I liked In Bloom the first time I heard it. Before we left on that tour in 1990, we had a rehearsal space in Seattle, and Kurt had started playing that song. Obviously, he had worked it out with Krist a little bit, and I jumped right in with what seemed totally natural. What I actually ended up playing on the recording was exactly what I did the first time I ever heard the song. So it's one of those songs where, for me, it just gelled instantly. Kurt never really talked about his lyrics much or what they were even about. I remember once the only thing about him ever talking about lyrics, we were in this hotel room. And he's like, I'm trying to come up with some lyrics. Anything that rhymes with this and rhymes with that, whatever words, just throw them out. It was sort of a grab bag of ideas, just spewing out words. Apart from that, he was always quiet about it, so I'm not really sure. I remember back in 2000 or something, when someone alerted me that I actually had a song on Nevermind, and I was thinking, I do? What the heck song is that? Then I found out it was Polly. I gave it a listen and I remember now. There was a small little room in the studio and it was big enough for just 2 people and an amp. It was pretty small. They put me in that room with my ride cymbal. So it was just me and my ride cymbal and I listened to this song. Every time that one little cue part or break came up, I hit the ride cymbal. So I hit it like 4 times, which is all it required, the entire song. And then that was that. It was the actual recording which ended up on the record. It was the one song I guess Kurt had said, no, I definitely do not want to redo this. And I guess they figured it doesn't have a whole lot to it. There's only a little bit of drums. Another song I liked was Lithium. In all, I was really grooving on all the new stuff. In fact, much of this stuff was so new that I was learning and adapting to the song, the parts and the things I wanted to play as the tour went on. Many of the songs we recorded were songs that we didn't have a whole lot of opportunity to play together as a band and rehearse before we went out on that tour. I'm sure Kurt and Krist played out the songs, but before we left for the tour, for the majority of the songs, we maybe had 1 or 2 rehearsals. But by the end, when we got into the studio, I was pretty comfortable with what I was doing. And really, pretty much like In Bloom, a lot of those songs, they just sat right in. A lot of it fell into place really easily. As mentioned before, I definitely took it as a compliment that Dave replicated many of my original drum parts when they recorded Nevermind, but most of them are so minuscule that people comparing the records, unless they were hardcore music buffs, I think the average listener wouldn't even notice that much. The most notable change of any of them was In Bloom. On the main verses of the song, I would just use a single kick thing, and Dave threw in an extra kick, and everything else on that is pretty much identical. And then with Breed 2, there's just one part where he began a drum roll fill just a half measure sooner than I did mine. Everything else aside from that is the same. Like I said, very minor changes that most people might not notice. I thought it was totally cool. I was very honored that he did that. The first time I heard that record, Nevermind, Ben Shepard, my ex-bandmate from one of my previous bands, Soundgarden's bassist, came over. Actually, I went over to his place. He had a recording on cassette. He said, "This is Nirvana's new record. You should check it out. It comes out next month," or something. He has somehow gotten a copy of it before its release. When I heard it, I was like, oh man, this is freaking killer. I loved it right off the bat. It's one of those things where, again, I actually became a Nirvana fan when I was no longer in the band. When you're inside of it, it's a little different. It's work and it's all this kind of stuff. It was kind of refreshing to be able to kick back and go, okay, I can totally listen to it. Because anytime I hear my own music, I always get in this critic mode. I can't really relax and hear it for what it is. When I heard that record though, I was like, wow. 1, I really liked the record and thought the songs were great. And 2, I was like, okay, I can really get into it. And it was nice to know that it wasn't me I was having to listen to. I think Kurt was a great songwriter because it's not easy to take something simple and make it sound interesting. If you can put together a song that has 3 or 4 chord changes in it and keep people interested, that's a trick. It's a trick to make things simple sound good. And one of his best qualities was his writing. And just not musically, but vocally as well. He had great vocal melody ideas. And that to me is key in any good songwriting. You can have a really cool sounding song, but you also need a really good vocal melody. He was really good at coming up with that sort of stuff in Nirvana. Another thing I liked about his songwriting is he would say what he had to say, and if the song went on longer and he didn't have any more lyrics to it, he wouldn't push it and try to think of more stuff to sing. He'd just repeat what he'd written, which is exactly what I've always done. I think Kurt was a lot of time just thinking about things that rhyme. There was one time where we were on tour and he was writing some lyrics. I can't remember what song he might have been writing lyrics to at the time. He just looked up and said, hey, what rhymes with monkey? Just looking for some rhyme to fit in. It was like putting the little pieces of a puzzle together. I know he had an objective of what he was trying to say, but he had a very abstract way of saying it. And whether the lyrics actually made sense to anybody else or not, I don't know if that really mattered to him. Hey guys, I'm going to show you a couple of clips now from my interviews with Jack Endino, Bruce Pavitt, and Steve Fisk, where they talk about Nirvana and Chad Channing. How is Chad as a drummer in general? Did you enjoy working with him?
Oh yeah, he's a great drummer and doesn't get his due. Mm-hmm. He's got a looser kind of, I guess, a hippie feel or something like that. But, I think, he sounded great in Nirvana. I think that version of In Bloom that he did was really, really good. Mm-hmm. Maybe as good as their version with Dave, if you want to just talk about opinions or something like that. But no, I think Chad's an amazing drummer. He's a really good guitar player. He's a songwriter.
Mm-hmm. So. Yeah, I agree. I feel like Chad really doesn't get the due. I feel like he should have been in the Hall of Fame.
When things get that big, there's all kinds of, shoulda, this or that. Everybody means well.
I wasn't that happy with Chad's drum kit. It didn't record that well. I didn't like the sound all that much. There was a little too much hi-hat bleed on some things.
So you mentioned Chad Channing right now. For me, as a Nirvana fan, I always... first of all, I felt bad that he wasn't inducted to the Hall of Fame. I really felt he should have been. Secondly, I feel like he's kind of overlooked because all the credit to Dave Grohl, he's a monster drummer. He's one of the best drummers out there.
How you compete with Dave Grohl?
Exactly,
He's everywhere.
Exactly. But I feel like because you're competing with someone who's like Dave Grohl, he kind of gets overlooked. As a drummer, from your experience working with him, was he a good drummer to work with?
Yeah, he was great. He's artistically a very good drummer. He's got a good pop sense. As Dave Grohl has pointed out repeatedly, he was playing a lot of Chad Channing's drum parts on Nevermind because the band had demoed a lot of that material while Chad was still in the band. And Grohl has given credit where it's due to that because a lot of the drum arrangements, as it were from Chad. I think the time when you can really hear Dave Grohl playing Dave Grohl drum parts is in Utero.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Scentless Apprentice being the best example. You know, that's freaking, there's Dave being Dave, you know.
Yeah.
It starts with a drum pattern that's completely iconic. So, yeah, Chad doesn't get credit, but Chad, he was not as ambitious as Dave, and nobody plays as hard as Dave. I mean, I don't know how his limbs and joints and muscles can withstand that level of intensity, really, because Chad's a pretty good drummer, but Dave is an animal. So, you know, it's just different people doing different things. Chad has played in a number of other projects years later that I have recorded, actually, where the drumming is marvelous, including some of the songwriting, because Chad is actually a songwriter as well. People don't realize that. He has a couple of albums under the name Before Cars that are pretty nice tunes on those records. He's a pretty good singer. He plays bass well. Yeah, different destinies. What are you going to do?
Yeah, for sure. But, you know, I mean, thankfully, from what I've seen, you know, various interviews here and there, it seems that the split with Nirvana was amicable.
More or less. I mean, you know, I think they were just going in different directions. I know Chad wanted to contribute some songwriting, and that wasn't going to happen. You know, it's just, whatever. They were after something else. Now, you know, they didn't just end up with Dave Grohl initially. They did a tour with Dan Peters. They called up Dale Crover and did a tour with him. So there was a transitional period in there while they were still trying to decide who was going to be in the band. So, and, you know, they had to sort of check out these other people. And, you know, it's like, okay, Dan, well, he's great, but he's not quite what we're looking for. Okay, Dale, he's great, but he's in the Melvins, you know. And I wish I'd seen that tour where they played. I think it was in 1990 where they did a tour with Dale. It would have been interesting to see Dale.
I think it would have been the latter end of the summer of that year.
Probably before they went in the studio with Dave Grohl. Well, I don't know if the latter ended. When did they record Nevermind?
They recorded Nevermind in the end of May, early June, 91.
Okay, so yeah, it would have been toward the end of 1990 then, probably. Much later, when the deluxe Bleach came out many years later, I reminded Sub Pop that they had a complete live show with Chad Channing on drums recorded at the Pine Street Theater in Portland, and I believe it was from early 1990. And we pulled out the tapes, and I made a mix of that entire show, which is essentially on the double vinyl version of the Bleach reissue. That's the second disc. So sometime in 1990, Chad was still playing with them. And then after that, we'd have to talk about the session that I did with Dan Peters on drums, which was just Sliver, one song. And then I think they did a few shows with Dan Peters. The Motorsports Garage here in Seattle gets mentioned. I was not at the show. And then they did some kind of tour with Dale Crover. Again, I don't know the exact dates. I didn't see those shows. And then he joined the band and they recorded Nevermind.
This is an open-ended question. Of all the songs you've recorded with Nirvana, was there any one in particular that you were most satisfied with how it came out, the recording?
Floyd the Barber, probably.
Really?
Yeah.
And if I'm asked why?
The drum sound. I wasn't that happy with Chad's drum kit. Dale, on the other hand, had a very, very good drum kit, and he knew how to tune it and play it. I mean, he was an exemplary drummer. Now, Chad is a pretty damn good drummer himself, but Dale is one of the top drummers in the world, in my estimation. And I mean, he's up there. He's a monument. And even in 1988, Dale was an amazing drummer with a very good sounding kit, and he knew how to tune it. So the thing is, if you're recording on 8 tracks, you only have a few channels to use for the drums. So you can't rely on technical trickery to make the drums sound good. You have to get the sound at the source. It has to be a good sounding kit played in a well-balanced manner. And that is what I had with the songs with Dale, is, you know, just 5 or 6 microphones submixed onto 3 or 4 channels sounded great because he was a good drummer and he had a very, very good sounding drum kit. So that made my recording sound a lot better than an 8-track recording because it sounded like I had recorded the drums with some full multi-track, array of microphones and technology. And it was really just a great sounding kit. The drums make a lot of difference. So from a technical angle, I like the way Floyd the Barber and Paper Cuts sound. Also the fact that I was allowed to remix those specifically for the Bleach record, rather than using the original rough mixes we had made on January 23rd, which is what went on the Incesticide record, was those original mixes that took about 10 minutes each. Floyd the Barber was originally part of those sessions, as was Paper Cuts, but those two songs are not on Incesticide. They were on Bleach from the get-go, but I was allowed to mix them more deliberately because it was part of the Bleach sessions. Like at the time we were doing Bleach, I think they actually did a version of Floyd the Barber with Chad and decided not to use it because we all, even Chad, agreed like, no, we can't beat the version with Dale Crover on it. Let's just use that one. And Paper Cuts, I don't know if they ever even played that with Chad. They didn't try and record that. They just said, now we'll just use the Dale version of that one too. So I had a chance, and I'm pretty sure that Kurt added a backing vocal to Paper Cuts during the Bleach sessions. There's a harmony on it, yeah. And so then I, mixed it again from there. So those were, as we were doing Bleach, the plan was to borrow those two songs. Now, Beeswax got added later. It didn't get remixed. It's just the straight up mix from January 23rd, as far as I remember. It might be a different mix than the one that's on Incesticide. You'd have to compare them side by side in order to tell. And since they were mastered at different times by different people, who knows? Plus one is probably from a backup safety copy and one probably isn't. Who knows about that either? I don't know.
What was Chad Channing like? He's such an important member of that band, but unfortunately he gets overlooked sometimes. What was he like to work with?
He was a little bit like Kurt. He was both Kurt and Chad were very soft-spoken, okay? Sensitive, soft-spoken creative types, for sure. Krist Novoselic was the exact opposite of that, which created a kind of an interesting dynamic. If you were backstage, Krist was the one who was bouncing up and down on the couch, and both Chad and Kurt were way more laid back. So, ultimately it didn't work out for Chad, but he's a really sweet guy and super nice. One of the nicest guys you'll ever meet. And he and Kurt, I thought, complemented each other very well as personalities. That was my take.
Yeah, and often, obviously Dave Grohl is one of the most, famous drummers in rock and roll history, right? He's one of the best ones out there. But I also feel like Chad is still a good drummer. I just feel like he gets totally overshadowed because of the Dave thing. You know what I mean? I feel bad for the guy a little bit.
Yeah, I agree. And Chad, I'm just going to scale back a little bit. And you had asked me, hey, when did you really feel that Nirvana was turning around? Initially we heard him, it wasn't with Chad. I think they're so. I remember the first show that Chad played, there was definitely a marked difference. A year later, a year after that kind of debut in spring of 88, which would be like spring of 89, they released Bleach at this huge showcase that we set up, Tad Nirvana Mudhoney in Seattle. Bleach came out. By that time, their shows were really coming together. And if you check out any of the in-store shows or Google any of the shows from that period on, you're going to see them really come together. And Chad had a lot to do with that. I will say that.
One thing you said that stuck out to me is that Chad and Kurt had similar personalities.
Yeah, yes. If you walked into a room and there were two quiet guys in the corner, it would be Chad and Kurt. Kurt was, let's straight up, Kurt was a genius. Kurt was a genius, so he was a very creative person. He had more of a sense of humor. So if you had a conversation with him, it was always interesting. It was philosophical. He was a deep thinker. He was funny. but he was soft-spoken, and so was Chad, and that's kind of what I'm getting at, is they were both somewhat gentle personalities off stage. Kurt could really flip a switch when he got on stage, for sure.
One of the things that's been very interesting for me over the past few years, having had the chance to speak to people like yourself and others who actually knew Nirvana on a personal level, is getting to hear that inside story of the band. So again, having known Nirvana personally, having known Kurt personally, how do you feel about the image of Kurt that's out there, that he's this bigger than life person?
That's rock and roll. That's they used to throw the term rock god around because that's how society would relate to people who could rock a coliseum. And I just think music does not have the same cultural impact as it did 25, 30 years ago. And my belief is that young people are so distracted with social media that music, like going home and listening to a whole album and really feeling it, young people have less and less time for that. They're too easily distracted. So I can't think of, this is one of the reasons why we keep circling back to Nirvana and Cobain, because at that time, they had such a huge cultural impact because Kurt was extremely talented and extremely outspoken. And really, I think it's been harder and harder for somebody to kind of step in and do that, in part because music isn't as central to people's lives as it was at that time. If you spend two hours a day on Facebook, that's 2 hours less than you're spending listening to music.
Yeah, it's definitely a different landscape now. And so with that said, do you think it's possible for there to be a new underground band like Nirvana that could possibly go super viral, and not just go viral, but hold that popularity long term?
I'm just going to say it's just going to be a lot more difficult for, certainly there's popular artists out there that have millions and millions of Instagram followers and so forth. So I do think there are some artists out there who can kind of command that level of respect and attention, but there's not a lot because, again, people are so distracted. And the rock culture is weaker now than it used to be. That's pretty obvious. You look at the charts, what's popular. I mean, rock and roll, rock music, guitar music still exists, but it's culturally it's not in the ascendancy.
Do you think it could ever get back up there?
It could. Yes, it could, and there have been some moments, in the 21st century. I look at like a group like the White Stripes, for example, who are just like, wow, they're just a brilliant group, but I think Jack White was is probably as brilliant as Kurt Cobain, but they didn't have the traction that Nirvana did.
In terms of Nirvana's traction, Nirvana, of course, was the focal point of an entire movement. They were the focal point of the grunge explosion. And one of the key places in terms of the history of grunge is, of course, Olympia. I was recently in Olympia for a bit, and when I was there, it did strike me very much as a college town, so it's not surprising to me that a city like Olympia, which has a lot of creative, youthful energy, was one of the key places in terms of grunge's development. In your opinion, do you feel that Olympia's youthfulness contributed to the development of grunge?
Yeah, if you really want to get to the roots of it, I came of age in the punk era of the late 70s in Chicago. I came out to Olympia in 1979 to attend Evergreen State College. And thankfully, Evergreen had one of the most unique radio stations in the country. The station was called Chaos Radio, and it featured and promoted independent music. So that's where I got my schooling on indie music and how I was able to kind of initiate the Sub Pop project, which turned into the Sub Pop Records Corporation and so forth. So in a nutshell, Olympia had quite a history of independent thinkers, and I believe that Kurt really fed off that. In particular, there was a gentleman there by the name of Calvin Johnson, who I've mentioned previously, who I worked with at Chaos, who had started his own label, K Records. He was a singer in this group called Beat Happening. And Kurt was so enamored with Calvin that he tattooed the K Records logo on his arm, just to give you a feel for that. So I think Kurt really fed off the college energy of the town, punks and indie music people in the town.